Now, ZBrush gives us the ability to sculpt and paint in layers, much like you would experience in Photoshop. The layering system is found here under the Tool menu under Layers. Now, it's very important that you not get confused with the Layer menu up here at the top of the screen. This was from ZBrush's 2.5D illustration toolset. This has nothing to do with sculpting. The Layer menu up here at the top of the screen is, for all intents and purposes, not really used anymore. You might find it useful if you were using the document window to create an alpha, but even those are antiquated techniques at this point. So it's best to just disregard this layer menu and only focus on the layers menu found under the tool menu. So here we've got our alien bust. Make sure that we're on the head subtool and make sure that we're at our highest subdivision level. Now we're going to go to the layers menu and create a new layer. Now you see it says untitled layer and it's in record mode. Now if I want to change the layer name, I'm going to change the name and I'm going to call it Scales. So anything that I sculpt in this layer is going to be adjustable by this opacity, and I can turn it on and off. So let's take a look at how we can do that. I'm going to go ahead, make sure that my X symmetry is turned on, and I'm going to mask out part of the head here. I'm going to put a scale pattern on the back and sides of the head. So it'll just be a different little bit of texture that's sculptural that's been added to this creature. Let's extend this mask down to the back and to the shoulders. Now I want to feather the edges of the mask. So what I'll do is I'll step down a couple subdivision levels and watch what happens to my layer. When I step down my subdivision levels, the layer controls disappear. Now I am still in this layer and anything that I add will be added to this layer, but you can only adjust the settings of your layer when you're on the subdivision level where you actually created the layer. That's important to remember because once you start adding layers, you have to be on that subdivision level to adjust them. That's why I always try and add layers when I'm sure that I'm at the highest subdivision level that I'm going to create. There we go. Now I can control click to feather this mask, and I'm going to control click on the background to invert it. Now I'm going to step back up to my highest subdivision level. I only step down so I could feather the edges of that mask more effectively. I'll now go to the Surface menu. So we'll go to Surface, turn on Noise, and that'll bring up the Noise Maker plugin. We'll turn on Edit, there we go, and we'll rotate around to the back and zoom in. If you want to learn more about Noise Maker, there's an entire video chapter just on Noise Maker that I encourage you to watch. I'm going to open up Noise Plug, and this opens up a whole separate section of this menu. Noise Plug is the Noise Maker. I'm going to turn on Veroni, and then click OK. I'm going to take Mix Basic Noise and turn that down to 0, and I'm going to turn my strength up so I can see what I'm going to get here. There you can see we've got this really cool kind of scale pattern. I'm going to adjust my plugin scale. Let's turn it down a little bit like that. And because I feathered the edges of the mask, the effect is going to be weaker along the edges there. So let's go ahead and click OK. Now you can see it's applied that texture. I'm going to come down here and click Apply to Mesh because this right now is just a procedural projection. This is not part of the geometry. But if I click Apply to Mesh, that will bake that down into my mesh. Now if I clear the mask, you can see that we've got that nice scale texture there. Now if we go back to our Layer menu, it's still in record mode. I'm going to click next to record, and that is the eyeball. That just shows me that it's set to visibility instead of record. If I try and sculpt now, it's going to tell me that the mesh has deformation layers, that I have to be in a recording layer to actually sculpt or paint. That's another important thing to keep in mind with layers. Once you create a layer, you have to be in a recording layer to change your model. So now I can adjust the intensity. If I turn this down, you see it changes the opacity of that layer. I can even go into the negative range and invert that so it's pressing in instead of out. We'll bring that back up to 100%. Now down here I've got some other options. I can create a new layer here. We've already renamed the layer. I have the option to duplicate the layer. So if I duplicate this layer, it'll effectively double it up. Here I have the option to delete a layer. Here I can merge down. So if I click merge down, it'll merge those two layers down into one. So I've effectively doubled the effect of that layer by duplicating it and merging it. And I can invert the layer, and that will just invert the layer effect. Now I can bake them all. If I've got multiple layers and I just want to get rid of them, I can bake them down, and that will remove them. It'll bake down the effects and get rid of all of my layers. But let's create a new layer now, and instead of doing sculpting on this layer, we'll do painting on this layer. Let's do some kind of a spot pattern up here at the top of the head. I'll go to my standard brush, turn on RGB, and let's select maybe a purple color here. And I'm just going to paint some kind of a pattern on here. This will be bilaterally symmetrical, so it's kind of like the type of skin patterning you might see in the natural world. I'll go to the drag rectangle stroke, and I'll go to this irregular alpha here, let's say alpha 8. Let's turn our draw size up, and let's turn the focal shift way down so we just get a hard edge on that patterning, and we'll just do some little patterns here, like this. Now this poly paint lives in this layer. So let's do a little bit more, just breaking up the edges here. And one more there. Now if I click next to record, I'm back in visibility mode. If I step down my subdivision levels, I no longer have access to changing this layer. Step back up, go back into record mode. There we go. If I step back down, I no longer have access to change the layer. That's while I'm in record mode. If I step back up to my layer or to my subdivision level where I created that layer, now I have the ability to change it or change its visibility. Go to visibility. Now I can dial back the opacity on this, turn it back up. Perhaps I want to go to the Polypaint menu, and I'm going to use the Adjust Colors plugin. Now, if you have not seen the video yet, there's an entire video just on Adjust Colors. Now, because I'm in a layer, this is only going to impact what's actually in this layer. Oops, let's expand that out again. Also, we need to make sure that we are in record mode. Otherwise, any changes we make are not going to update. So let's go back to Polypaint. Let's go to Adjust Colors, and let's select purple. Let's go ahead and blur the mask, and let's adjust our tolerance a little bit. Let's turn that down. Get that real close to the edge there. Okay, now I'm going to adjust my hue. Click OK. And there you see that that adjusts just that poly paint that was in that layer. If I clear my mask, you see the effect that we get. I can go back to Adjust Poly Paint. And let's go ahead and maybe select green this time. Let's turn our tolerance, or adjust our tolerance on here. Tell you what, let's just grab this and adjust our tolerance. There we go. Let's invert that mask. Blur it. And let's adjust our saturation here. I want to get that right up to the edge. There we go. Click OK, and there you see we can adjust that color based on our adjust colors controls, but it's not going to have an effect or be able to do anything to any of that poly paint that doesn't live inside of a layer. So let me go to my layers menu again, and if I adjust my layer opacity, I can turn that down into 0, removes it completely. I can turn it up a little bit, fade it out just slightly. I can duplicate this layer, thereby sort of changing the color intensity just by doubling it up. And then of course I can go in and do color adjustments on this. If I go into record, go to poly paint, adjust colors, and let's go ahead and do a color sample of that. Change our hue. Click OK. Now that color, if we go back to our layers, we can adjust independently of the red sitting beneath it. So we can sort of mix those two together if we'd like to. So if I go to masking, I have the ability now to mask by poly paint. So what I can do is I can come down here and go to mask by color, mask by poly paint, and it's a very, very similar effect here. I can select the color that I want to adjust. I can blur my mask. I can adjust my tolerance just so I get a little bit of an edge on that. Click OK. And now I've got a mask that's isolating just sort of the edges here. If I control click, I can invert that mask. I can go back to poly paint, adjust colors, and then I can pick up that mask and then I can make a major change to the poly paint here and click OK. Clear the mask, and now we get that nice kind of orange feathering around the edges of our poly paint. Go to my layers, and I'm going to select this layer here. I'm just going to go one layer up. I find it best to select layers with these arrows because if you click the layer, sometimes you accidentally change the opacity. I'll click merge down, and that merges those two poly paint layers down. And then I can adjust the opacity on those, but it still maintains that nice kind of orange feathered edge there. So poly paint and sculpting can both live in layers. Again, anything that I've got that's not in a layer, I'm not going to be able to change. I can't change that poly paint that's in the base that's not living in a layer. It's only those things that are sitting inside of a layer. Let's rename this, and we'll call it head pattern. Now we can also create a layer for large shape changes. You'll see this if you watch the video on blend shapes. We'll create blend shapes and facial expressions using layers. But I'm just going to take the move brush here, and let's say I just want to see what this might look like with an entirely different head shape. I can come in here and make these big changes at the lower subdivision levels. Maybe I want to change the width of the head and the shape of these antennae. Let's bring these out and give them a little bit of a curve maybe. Take the move brush, add a little bit more of a bulge to the head here. Take the magnify brush, and let's just really go to town on this cranium, make it huge. And maybe the ends of these antennas a little bit. Oops, let's undo that. Turn our brush size down, and there we go. We can get the ends of those antennas. And take the move brush and give those a little bit more of a curve. Step back up to our highest subdivision level, and that will return the layer controls. Click the eyeball next to it, and now I can dial this back and dial it back up. And that way, if perhaps it happens to me often, someone asks to see a wedge, what would this character look like with various increments of a different head size? I can do 10% increments of that head size and export images for an art director to look at and say, oh, okay, I like option number 5. Let's go with that one. So it's really nice to be able to have these types of big shape changes, these big sculptural changes represented in our mesh, as well as these finer details. Let's say they want to see it without the scales. I can turn the scales down to 0 or just turn off visibility on that layer, and I can show it with and without those details. So the layers menu is very, very powerful. The thing that you just need to keep in mind is once you start creating layers, you have to be in a layer with record mode on to make changes. The layer menu is also used for blend shapes, like I said, and it's also used with Subtool Master, which if you watch the video on posing in Subtool Master, you'll see that it is possible that we can store our character pose in a layer for each subtool, which can be very, very nice. If we want to return to a neutral position and make some changes, we can do that and then return to our pose as necessary. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next video. So let's take a look now at how we can use ZBrush layers to support us in creating facial blend shapes. We'll go ahead and take a look at that now. So now we've reset ZBrush and loaded in our character again. We're at our highest subdivision level and we have no layers. So we're going to create a new layer and we're going to call this layer Mouth Closed. With this layer in record mode, I'm going to step down subdivision levels. And let's just turn off our poly paint. We don't need color for this. And now at our lowest, well, not quite the lowest, I think we are at the lowest subdivision level. That's good. We want as few polygons as possible to have to deal with at this stage. I'm going to close the lips. So I'm just going to take the move brush and I'm just going to shift the lower lips up. Let's mask out the lower jaw. Take the upper lips and bring these down, and let's shift that nose down a little bit because he is snarling. It's raising the tissue in that area. Let's invert that mask and let's bring this up to meet. Oops, let's mask that upper lip a bit more. Control, click, and drag. Control, click, and drag. Get a marquee around that. Now we should be able to get that lip without affecting the upper lip. We'll turn off X-symmetry because we actually have an asymmetrical sculpt here in the mouth. Invert that mask and let's just bring that upper lip down. Control click to feather the mask, and we just want to bring those lips together. Clear the mask and let's just bring the corners of the mouth down a little bit so we're not quite smiling. Now we'll zoom in here and just take the inflate brush and just gently inflate those lips together, like so. Now I'll step back up my subdivision levels. And let's step down one or two more and just do a couple little tweaks to the shapes here. Again, we just want to bring the corners of the mouth down so that we don't have that little smirk. We'll make that a different shape. Make sure that our nostrils come down. Again, because the nose comes up with the nasolabial folds when he's snarling. There we go. Now let's step up to our highest subdivision level. Go to our Layers menu and go into View mode. So now mouth closed at 100% is the mouth closed, and if we dial this back, we can bring those lips back apart. So let's create a new layer now. Create a new layer, and let's make this brow up. Again, I'll step down my subdivision levels, and I'm going to use the move brush, but I'm going to, when I touch the mesh, there we go. When I touch the mesh, I'm going to touch down with the move brush, then hold the shift key, and I can slide these faces up. So that's basically touch down with the move brush and then press the shift key, and that will slide faces along the surface of the mesh. Let's bring that up a bit, bring that up, and let's scooch those together a little bit. Now we'll step back up to our highest subdivision level. Click the eyeball next to record, and we can go back and forth. Let's Control N. We accidentally snapshotted that to the canvas. There we go. We can slide that slider up and down and get some facial animation in the brow. So let's set this back to 0 just by hitting 0 manually. And let's create a new layer, and we'll call this Brow Furrow. There we go. And again, step down your subdivision levels. It's much, much, much easier to sculpt these facial shapes at a lower subdivision level because you're not dealing with millions of polygons. We're dealing with far fewer polygons. So let's bring this down. Let's compress the corrugator and the brow muscles here and make it feel like he's really crunching this together. Let's shift these faces over using that trick with the move brush and shift. Now we're going to invert that mask, and let's just bring this up a little bit, create a little buckle there at the bridge of the nose. And I'm going to take the inflate brush, turn down my Z intensity, and just do a little bit of inflating here so it feels like these are compressing a little bit. Step back up to our highest subdivision level. And now we can go to View and use the slider to adjust that brow furrow. So let's set that back to 0. And let's create a new layer. Let's call this Smile. We'll step down our subdivision levels. And we'll turn on X symmetry for this. And let's just bring the corners of that mouth up a little bit. So it's tugging those up and then shift those back as we did using the Shift key. I'll take the inflate brush and just gently inflate. Let's turn off X symmetry for that because the nasolabial folds here are not symmetrical. Let's inflate the flesh along here so it feels like it's buckling up. Take the damn standard brush and we can just crease that in just a little bit. And now step back up our subdivision levels to the highest. Click the eyeball next to record, and then we can scrub that smile up and down. So let's set smile to 0. And let's set mouth closed to 0. And let's set brow furrow to 1. And let's create a new layer now. We'll rename this and call it neck. So here I want the platysma, the ropey muscles of the neck to really come out as if he's straining when he's creating that snarl. So I'll go to the Clay Tubes brush, change to alpha 1, and I'm just going to stroke along here, creating those tendons, really bunching those tendons up in the neck. Maybe go to the standard brush with alpha 1 as well. I just really want to punch these up a little bit. Let's step up a subdivision level, and let's really go to town with that. Just make those feel like they're really getting strained. And catch some shadow in there, holding down the Alt key. There we go. Put a little bit of smooth in between there and step back up to our highest level. Now you see we've got this nice straining platysma muscle here. Let's click the eyeball next to it and then we can dial that back. So that'll really play nicely with the snarl. As the character snarls, we can bring that neck musculature in so it feels like he's really straining as that snarl comes into play. So we can set that back to 0. Now I'm going to go to the Movie menu, open up Timeline, and click Show. Now the timeline allows us to do animations inside of ZBrush. So I'm going to first off click 2 keyframes here for the camera. That's how you have to start every animation in ZBrush, is have 2 keyframes to the camera start and end. So let's scroll back to the beginning here and let's set mouth closed to 1. And let's set brow up to 0. Brow furrow we shall set to 0. Smile is set to 0 and neck is set to 0. And let's set mouth closed. Yeah, let's leave mouth closed at 1. So now with mouth closed selected, I'm going to click a keyframe here. You see I've keyed the mouth closed layer. So if I scroll forward a little bit, let's key it again. Scroll forward a little bit more and then we will set this to 0. And that's going to start opening that mouth. Let's set that manually to 0 and then we'll keyframe that here. So as I scroll through the timeline now, you'll see that animation is right there. Now let's go to brow furrow. We'll select brow furrow. Make sure we are at the first keyframe here. Keyframe it at 0. Now you can see the ghosts of my other keyframes. So here is the next 0 keyframe for mouth open. Let's keyframe that there. And then I'd like the brow to start furrowing, and I think I'd like it to be completely furrowed just before the mouth is totally open. So let's turn that up to 1. And then we'll add a keyframe just before the mouth finishes opening. So if we scrub through that now, you'll see the brow begins to move at the same time as the mouth, but it completes its range of motion just before the mouth is totally snarled. So let's come back down here now and let's go to neck. So we'll set neck to 0, keyframe it here, and again we see the ghosts of the other keyframes. Let's scroll to here, leaving it at 0. And then we'll go to the full range of the snarl, and let's set neck to 1, and keyframe that there. So now as we slide along the timeline there, we see the neck come into play as well. The muscles of the neck straining as that snarl comes into play. Now as he's snarling, it would be nice to see the lower lids move as well, because that's a key part of that facial expression. If you raise your cheeks and raise your nasolabial folds, your lower eyelids can't help but come into play. So let's create a new layer. We'll name this layer lower eyelids, raise. We're in record mode. We're just going to step down our subdivision levels. And I'm going to mask out the lower lids, and we're going to leave X symmetry turned off on this because the eyelids, the eyes themselves, are asymmetrical in this sculpture. I'm going to take the move brush, and I just want to slide these lower lids up a little bit so we get a little bit of a, the eyes coming up and covering where the irises will be. It'll create more of a malicious kind of feeling. It'll add a little something to that snarl. Let's step back up our subdivision levels. Go into the eyeball view, and then as we scrub this, you'll see those eyelids come up. So let's set this to 0. Keyframe it at 0. Make sure it's visible. Turn visibility on. I'm going to get rid of that keyframe. Just click and drag off the timeline to get rid of the keyframe. There we go. Set this to 0 and keyframe that. Scroll forward. Keyframe it one more time, and then let's get to the full extent of the snarl, and let's bring this all the way up to 1 and keyframe it there. So now as we scroll through this, you'll see those eyelids come into play as well, creating a much more realistic kind of facial expression. So if I want to save this work, including my timeline, what I need to do is go to File, Save As. I'm going to save a project file. Now a Z-tool will save all of my layers, but the project file will save my timeline as well. So I'm going to do that now. I'm just going to go to File, Save As, and save a project file. Now, how do we get our blend shapes out of ZBrush? Well, there's two ways to do that. The first way is we can actually render a movie of our animation in action. I can do that by going to the movie palette, and I'm going to set it to large, which gives me the full resolution of my document. So if I go to document, that will be the resolution of my video. I can set that to HD resolution if I want HD, or smaller if I just need a test file. Now going back to the movie menu, I have the option to do the window, which is the full window including the interface, which is really not useful. Doc gives us just the document, just this image here. So now what I will do is I will press Control, Shift. Oh, one more thing. Before we do that, let's go to Movie. And down here we have Overlay Image. Turn your overlay image opacity down to 0. If you have a logo or watermark you want to put on your video, you can add that here. Go to Title Image and turn Fade In and Fade Out down to 0. So that will basically get rid of any sort of fade in image, which you could add here if you wanted to, and then give us just the animation that we're about to render. So to render that, Control, Shift, click under the timeline, and it will start to go through each frame. There we go. Control Shift click. You can see it's recording the frames now. That is Control Shift click under the timeline. Now it'll go through my keyframes here, and once I get past this last keyframe, I can actually escape out of the recording. There we go. We've reached the full extent of the animation. So we can just go ahead and escape out. Just hit the escape key. Now if we go back to the movie menu, you'll see that we have the option to play our movie. So if I click play, here you can see we have an animation. Now if I want to export that animation, I'll turn on high quality and then click export. And then I can export this as an MPG. So I'll save that out, just like so. And it'll play through that animation. Now let's say I want to add some more keyframes now. So I've got this nice snarl here. So what I'll do is I'll scroll ahead a little bit and I will go ahead and key each one of these layers. So we'll go to eyes, let's select up. The arrows are very handy if you want to select a layer without accidentally changing its value. Go up, go up, go up, and go up. So now I've keyframed all those layers at the same point a few seconds later. Now let's bring it back down to neutral. So I'm going to come down to here. Let's set mouth closed to 1. And let's keyframe that down here. Let's step down and take brow up. And let's go ahead and raise the brow. Maybe he feels a little bad for being angry. We'll keyframe that there. Go to brow furrow, set brow furrow to 0. Keyframe that a little bit earlier, about there. Let's go to neck, set that to 0. Keyframe that. And let's go to lower eyelids and let's set that to 0 and keyframe that as well. So if we scrub through this, you'll see the animation. He snarls and then has second thoughts, closes his mouth, raises his eyebrows a little bit, and seems a little bit sad. So we want to render a new version of our film. So what we need to do is go back to the movie menu and click delete. And that will delete the video that's in there. And now we can create a new one just by Control Shift clicking. And you see it's recording frames. And we'll just let it play through to its last keyframe and a little bit of time afterwards. Now we can go to the movie menu and we can play our movie. We get our snarl, we get our relax, and then our second thought. Again, if we want to export that, we go to the movie menu and export from here. Now, you don't have to do your render with just the default viewport. I can do a BPR render here. So if I do a BPR render, go to my render menu, go to BPR shadow, and let's just turn up angle a little bit and then redo that render just to soften the edges of our shadows. There we go, gives us a little bit of a nicer render. Now if I Control Shift click, well, first off, let's delete the frames that we already have. Control Shift click, and it's going to render each frame before it writes it out. So I'm going to clip out this render because this is actually going to take a bit of time because it does BPR render each individual frame. But it's a really nice way to show the best look of your animation possible by giving it a nice render. So I'll be back when this render is complete. Now that render has completed, if we go to the movie palette here and click play movie, we can see the render with the nice shadows. So it's a really good way to present your work. So again, you can export that with the export button here. Just make sure that you have export highest quality turned on. And it does export as an MPG file. Now I mentioned that there was another way to get your blend shapes out of ZBrush. If you happen to be a Maya user, this is a really interesting thing that you can do. If you go to the Z plugin menu and open up Maya blend shapes, here you have the ability to either export selected, visible, or all. If you select all, it will do all of your layers, and then click Export Maya Blend Shapes. And what it does is it steps down to the lowest subdivision level and exports out each layer as a blend shape. Then it will open up Maya and it will set up the blend shape deformer for you. So if you do elect to do this, I would make sure that your lowest subdivision level is high enough that it's reasonable to use in Maya. I actually deleted my lowest subdivision level because it was actually quite low. So this would be reasonable to bring into Maya as maybe a LOD 50, maybe LOD 100. I might even elect to go with a slightly higher subdivision level, something like that, to work with in Maya. And if that were the case, I would just delete lower and then export from there. So again, that is under Z plugin, Maya Blend Shapes. So that is how we use layers in ZBrush to generate facial expressions and blend shapes, and actually how we can create animations directly inside of ZBrush using those layer tools. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I think layers are very, very powerful. They're very stable. Earlier iterations of them I didn't think were quite as stable as they are now. They can increase your file size, but I think that they're very, very powerful, especially in a pipeline where you may very well need to separate out certain bits of sculpture or painting. So you can easily mix and match, take one away, add another, especially in a conceptual phase. So I think it's a really, really powerful tool set to be aware of and understand how to use. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson. In this video, we're going to take a look at Noisemaker. Noisemaker is a tool within ZBrush that allows you to create procedural noise and different types of patterns on your mesh surface. We can apply them as procedural projections, or we can actually bake them into the mesh. So let's step down to our lowest subdivision level, and we'll go to the UV mapping menu and morph UV. Now you can see, because it's a default polysphere, this does have UVs on there. But Noisemaker doesn't require UVs, but it can project either 3D or it can project into actual UV space. So we'll step back up to our highest subdivision level and go to the surface menu. Now under the surface menu, you'll find a light box for noise presets. And these are actually really handy, and it's a nice way to learn Noisemaker is to see how these different shapes have been put together. If you just go and open it up and look at all the different changes that have been made to the base interface settings, you'll understand how things like the erosion pattern here or the bricks can be created using the procedural tools inside of Noisemaker. So I'm going to go to Noise, and here you see we've got this window that navigates just like the main ZBrush window. We see this in Adjust Poly Paint as well. Just use the same hotkeys that we use inside the document window. Just Alt, click, and drag, and etc., etc. Now, here we have noise scale. If I turn that up, it increases the scale of the noise. Turn it down, it decreases the noise scale. Now, currently it's a 3D projection, which means it's being projected from outside the model. If I turn on UV, it's projecting it into the UV coordinates. So if I turn the scale down, turn the strength up, you can see the effect that we get. Now, if we go to Noise Plug, this opens up another level within this tool. This is the Noisemaker menu that has all the different presets of different procedural items. So here we have, the basic noise is just sort of a Brownian noise. This gives us things like hex tiles or grids or erosion. So if we go to Grid and click OK, this is probably the easiest to see. Now, Noisemaker is mixing basic noise with the plugin noise. So we'll turn Mix Basic Noise down to 0. So I can actually see just the Noisemaker plugin. Plugin Scale, we'll scale that down, and that's adjusting that grid turn that down. Strength is set in the negative, so the grid's pushing in. So if we turn that in the opposite direction, the grid will push out. Let's adjust the scale again. And there we go. Now, if you want to adjust the X, Y, and Z offset and the X, Y, and Z angle or rotation or scale, you can do that here with these sliders. So let's go ahead now and click OK. And here you can see that that noise is now projected onto the mesh. Now this is only 98,000 faces. This is not actually part of the model. This is just a procedural projection. Now, if I want to actually make this part of the model itself, I'll need to increase my subdivision levels. So I'm going to divide a couple more times. Let's get up to about 1.5 million faces and click Apply to Mesh. Now you can see that that bakes that noise down into the actual geometry. So this is actually in the sculpture. So if I click Mask by Noise, I can mask based on that noise pattern that I just created. Control click and I can invert that. And let's go to the masking menu and turn off View Masks. So the mask is still there, but we're just seeing the object. Go back to Surface and click Edit. I can edit the surface that we've already laid out with Noisemaker. Next to Noisemaker, we click Edit, and now we can change our procedural noise. So we'll change from the grid to, let's put hex tiles on, and go ahead and click OK. Now we zoom in between those grid tiles, you see we have the hex tiles. So we'll scale it up, and let's adjust the strength so they're pushing in the opposite direction. So now we've got this interesting hex pattern that's happening underneath the grid pattern. And we can adjust the scale again, dial those down or up. Now you have to have the mesh divided quite high if you're going to make it very, very small and you want to bake it down into the mesh. So click OK. And there we can see is the procedural projection. Click Apply to Mesh, and that actually bakes it down into the geometry. So let's take a look at another thing that we can do with Noisemaker. I'm going to switch over to our alien character. So this is the alien bust that we created in our quick start video. Now, I actually use Noisemaker to create this very, very fine kind of skin texture all over the character. I find it useful just to sort of break up the specular component and just to get a little bit of noise on the surface before I go in and do more specific and targeted detailing. I'm going to mask out the forehead area here. Let's mask it up to about there. And I'm going to step down a couple subdivision levels, invert the mask, and then Control click on the masked area to feather it. Let's get the eyebrows masked out as well, and then Control click to feather. And we'll step back up to our highest level, and let's go back to Surface, Noise, Edit. Now let's orient and zoom in so we can actually see this area that we're working with. And actually I don't want to see the mask, so let's go to Masking and turn off View Masks. So there in the viewport the mask is not showing. We're still going to see it in the UI here, but we won't be seeing it in the interface. So what I want to do is I want to add a new noise plug to this unmasked area. So I'm going to select Erosion. Erosion selected, I'm going to turn down Mix Basic Noise and I'm going to turn the strength up, and plug-in scale will turn to about there. Now we're able to manipulate the color values as well. If you see there's color blend. So if I just color blend to this side, it's going to change the color on the raised portions. I'm going to go ahead and just bring this over to kind of a green. Get something kind of close to the base color of the character himself. So it's almost like there's strips of skin or some kind of raised keloiding or something there on this area, and then having that RGB element added in automatically is very, very handy. And that's the effect that we get. Now remember we have a mask, so let's go to our masking, View Mask. We have a mask So this color shift is not going to affect anything but the unmasked area on the forehead. So I'll go to Surface and I'll click Apply to Mesh. Now you'll see when we clear the mask, it has only been added to that unmasked forehead area. It's a very interesting eroded skin pattern there, with a color selection that's quite similar to our base tone. Again, we can go to Mask by Noise, and that will reapply a mask now based on the noise. And I can invert that mask, and we're going to go ahead and do some more painting on top of these bits. If I want to add more variation like we have in the skin here, maybe some speckles of blue, I'll do that by going to the standard brush, spray stroke, dot alpha, and for my color, I'll just click and drag and then sample color selection directly from my poly paint. There's that little bit of blue, turn on RGB and turn the RGB intensity down. And we'll go back to masking and hide the mask so we see our painting more clearly. So the mask is still there, it's just not visible in the workspace. So now as we spray through there, we start to get some of that bluish tint to match the rest of the poly paint. Clear the mask, and there we go. So Noisemaker is really nice for doing all sorts of things when it comes to skin, mechanical details, environments. It's also great for costumes. Here I have a shirt, and this is polygrouped, so the sleeves and the torso are separate. And also if we go to UV map, you can see that there's UV coordinates applied to this as well. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to add some hex tiles to the sleeves. So it's sort of like kind of a tactical armor or bodysuit. Something kind of you see a lot in like sort of mech and space suits. You see a lot of hex tiles in these designs. So let's divide up to 3 million polygons, turn off frame mode, and let's isolate the sleeves. Just Control-Shift-Click and then mask the body. Now we'll zoom in here and go to Surface, Noise, press the frame button here so we can frame the entire mesh, and we'll zoom into the arm. Now I don't want any basic noise. I just want to go to the Noise plugin and select Hex Tiles, click OK, turn the scale down, turn the strength up, and mix basic noise down. Now I'm going to change to UV. So now you can see the distortion has been corrected, but we will still have a seam along the UV seam. I'm going to adjust the plugin scale, turn that down. And let's change the strength so those hex tiles are raised and the gutters between them are actually recessed. So we get this nice tileable hex pattern on both sleeves. So if I'm happy with that, I click OK and then click Apply to Mesh. And that will now bake that down into the actual geometry. So let's add a weave texture onto the portion of the garment here that we have masked at this moment. So we'll invert the mask, edit our noise. I'm going to turn off Noise plugin here, and I'm going to turn my noise scale down, turn my strength down. Now here I've got an alpha on off. If I click that, I can browse to a JPEG or PSD. I'm going to select this tileable cloth texture. Now you see it's loaded into that swatch. And now I can adjust my alpha scale. So I'll turn the strength up so we can see it. Zoom in. If I adjust my alpha scale, I can change the relative size of that tileable fabric texture. Make sure it's going into UV coordinates and not 3D projecting, so that gives you a nice clean seam along the UV seam rather than stretching it. When I'm happy with that, I might scale it up a little bit. A little trick that I use when I'm texturing fabric and doing costumes for digital doubles, for example, often I will cheat the fabric weave up just a tiny bit in scale, because when it's actually one-to-one, with the physical fabric, it can often appear quite noisy in the render. So cheating it up just a tiny little bit can actually very much improve the visible quality. So let's click OK, and now you see we've got our fabric weave. And if I go back to edit, we can of course do the color blend on this. So if I were to change this to red, bring our color blend up, bring it around maybe to purple. Let's switch our color blend down this way. We can have a different color. Let's put green down in the base. Let's do that. Click OK. And there we go. We zoom in. Now this is not yet applied to the mesh. Click Apply to Mesh, and that bakes down both the sculptural detail and the RGB. Clear the mask, and now we have a fabric texture with a bit of RGB color and our hex tile texture pattern running down the sleeves. And that is Noisemaker. If you have a Noisemaker preset that you like, something you want to keep, you can always save it. Save button is here. And you can always open a saved file with the Open button. So hopefully you found this helpful. I think Noisemaker is one of the neater and more recent additions to ZBrush. It's a couple versions old, but it comes in really handy for all the reasons that I've just shown. There's so many things that you can accomplish with it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at two different methods of generating meshes inside of ZBrush. They're called shadow box and mesh extraction, and both of them are based around masking. So we'll begin with mesh extraction. We've got our alien bust here, and let's say that we want to create some kind of a headpiece for this character. I'm going to start by drawing a mask, and of course, whenever you're masking, the quality of your mask is totally dependent upon the underlying resolution of the mesh that you're painting on. However dense that mesh is going to determine how sharp and clean the edges of your mask are. So because of that, I want to make sure that I'm at the highest subdivision level when I paint this mask. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to mask out where I want this alien's helmet to sit. Make sure that it's got little allowances here for the antenna. Let's go ahead and bring this up and around and down. Come around to the back of the head here. Just mask out the base of the skull. And I'll hold down Control and Alt to subtract from the mask here in the front. Bring it to a little widow's peak, like that. And let's clean up the edges around here. Just make sure that this is nice and sharp. Now I could hold down the Control key, and in my masking brush, I do have the ability to change to mask circle. And if I click on the stroke, I can set this to square and center. So if I Control, click, Alt, and drag, I can make a perfectly circular unmasked area. Press the space bar, you can shift that around. Then when I let go, it will unmask that area. Now it does project through at that angle, so it unmasks that bit there. So I'll just go back to my mask pen. Let's mask this area out. And then I'll go back to the mask circle, and once again, Control Alt, click and drag, and we'll make an unmasked region here, and just place that right over the ear. Turn off perspective mode because we were getting a little distortion there. Press the space bar to shift that around, and then unmask, and we get this nice kind of arc there that gives some allowance for the ear and this little sideburn piece there. So this is a nice mask to represent the geometry that we're ultimately going to get from extraction. Now we go to the subtool menu. Under the subtool menu, we open up Extract. So let's zoom in here so we can see, and I click Extract. Now our thickness is set to 0.02. And as you can see, it's resulting in about that thickness, which is actually pretty good. This is a preview though. If I move the model, it disappears. So that's not actual geometry yet. So let's make it a little bit smaller. Let's make it 0.018. Extract. And there we go. We get our extraction again. It looks pretty good. Now I'm going to click Accept. Now that actually commits and generates a piece of geometry in the subtool menu, and that's our extraction. Control click and drag on the background to clear the mask. And let's go back to our masking brush. Let's go back to mask pen. And if we go to frame mode, you can see that this is just evenly spaced quad mesh. Interestingly, we're picking up polygroups here. I've got a polygroup for the outer shell. Let's go to display properties and turn on double-sided. Makes it easier to see those. We have the thickness polygroup, and then we have the inner shell. You see that's the exact mirror of the surface that I masked. So let's go back into frame mode. Now there's a couple things we can do to clean this up. If I go to deformation, I have some sliders here. I have polish by features. If I turn that on and then turn that slider up, it will polish it down and clean up the edges a little bit, as you can see there. I can Control-Shift-Click to isolate the outer shell, and then we can polish this a few more times. That's a little too much, so let's turn that down. I can take polish by groups, and let's make all the polygroups visible again. If I polish by groups, and that's going to polish each individual polygroup. So now we have a nice polished surface that maintains the sharp edges. I'm going to isolate the outer shell and mask it, invert that mask, and take my smooth brush and smooth the mesh. So what I did was I isolated the outer shell so I could mask the inner shell and the thickness, and that preserves the underlayers. So even though we're smoothing, it will still keep the shell laying against the surface. Now I want to add some detail to this, but before we do that, I want to remesh it. So we've got a more solid, clean underlying topology. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Geometry, Z-Remesher, and let's go to Detect Edges. That detects the sharp edges, and click Z-Remesher. And that's going to retopologize this helmet to 5,000 faces. Because I have Detect Edges turned on, it's going to hopefully preserve those edges and keep that sharp quality. So let that process, and there we go. There's our remesh. If we go into frame mode, you can see quite a nice topology that was generated automatically, but it did not preserve the polygroups. Those polygroups are quite handy, so I'm going to undo that and turn on Keep Groups and then Z-Remesh it again. And the Z-Remesher should now respect and maintain those underlying polygroups in the remeshed version. So we'll let that work through the remeshing process. And there we go. So if we Control-Shift-Click on each group, you see that they are maintained. So let's hide the outer shell, hide the thickness, mask the inner shell, and then reveal everything again by Control-Shift-Clicking on the background. So pretty happy with that. Actually, let's clear that mask. I'm going to divide a couple times. Now what I want to do is I want to add a little bit of detail to this. So what I can do is go to Noisemaker. If you haven't seen the video yet on Noisemaker, I encourage you to take a look at it. It's a very interesting tool. Go to Surface and turn on Noise. Zoom out a bit so we can see it. Go to Noise Plug, and that opens up the Noisemaker plugin. So there's a few different procedural options here. We can use hex tiles, nested shapes, psychedelic, scales. There's all sorts of different procedural shapes that we can use as surface noise. Let's go ahead and pick up hex tiles. Click OK. And this adds this hex tile texture here. I'll turn the plugin scale down and turn the strength up so we can actually see it, and turn down mix basic noise. Now it's a 3D projection, so the stretching is happening here, and I don't really want that, so I'm going to go to my adjust angle around the x-axis there, and you see that changes the direction of the projection. So if I do that, now the stretching is happening along the sides here and the back. Now if I had UV coordinates, I could avoid the stretching entirely. So if you wanted to be perfect, you would probably want to use UV master to create UVs, and then we could project into UV space. Because it's such an organized projection, let's go with something a little bit less geometrical. Let's go to, let's let's see, let's do Veroni. That's always a nice alien texture. So that's a nice kind of texture there. And let's use color blend. Switch the color blend down here. Let's make it purple. There we go. So I do like the look of that. Switch over here to this color. Let's make that dark green. There we go. I'm quite happy with that color blend. I'm turning the strength up a little bit and then click OK. And that gives me this texture on the helmet. I can go into edit and I can change my strength to a negative value, which will actually make it feel more like it's a hammered kind of metal. If I turn up the plugin size, this will actually work a bit better. So let's click OK. And now that feels more like a hammered metal. So I'm going to click divide a couple more times, get up to 2 million polygons, and then click apply to mesh. And then that bakes that down to the model. Now if I mask by noise, I can get a mask based on that actual noise that we just applied. I can sharpen this by Control-Alt-clicking on it. Go to our poly paint, make sure our spray and RGB is on the brush, sample color just by clicking and dragging, and then I can just spray color onto this. And I'm spraying in between the masked areas. It's a little too close to the base tone, so let's do green. And let's paint green into that. So that's painting all the in-between areas. Clear the mask, and now you see we have this interesting kind of texture. I'm going to get rid of the poly paint by going to RGB, selecting white, and go to color, fill object. Oops, turn up our RGB intensity, and then do that again. And then I'm going to change my material. Let's change it to sort of a green metallic. Turn on material, then go to color, fill object, and that fills the object with that material selection. So this is mesh extraction. You can create any type of shape that you can mask out on the surface of the underlying mesh, and then extract that into a new piece of geometry. I then retopologize and continue to sculpt in detail. Now let's take a look at another method of generating meshes inside of Zbrush, and that's called Shadowbox. So to access Shadowbox, go to the Lightbox, go to the Project folder, and inside the Project folder you'll find a variety of subfolders here. There's 3D printing, demo projects, jewelry, etc. We'll open up demo projects, and within then you'll find Shadowbox 128. Open that by double-clicking on it, and you get what looks like this cube here. It is a back, right, and bottom view cube. Now turn off perspective. Now the way Shadowbox works is, if you go to the tool menu, open up geometry, and open up Shadowbox, here you see the Shadowbox is generated by clicking this button here. There's also a button for polish. If I draw a mask, hold down Control and draw a mask here on the right view, it will generate geometry based on that mask. I'll turn on transparency so we can see through it. If I erase from the mask here, it will erase that geometry in that area. So currently, the circular mask is making the shape. If I go to the back view and then I draw a rectangular mask, it will limit the depth of that other mask. Now I've got a mask here and down here, but there's no geometry being created on the unmasked areas because this is being limited. Now if I go to the top view, and let's make another mask, again, it's bigger than the geometry that's being generated, but it's being limited by this mask here. If I come to the top view though, and then I erase out a circle here, I'll have a circle that's erased out through the geometry. Now when I'm happy with this, I simply turn off Shadowbox, and now I have a piece of geometry. Let's change the basic to the basic material too, so we see a little bit better. There we go. Now, the resolution of the Shadowbox was set to 128. You see this slider here. If I were to increase that, let's bring it up to 512. And then turn on Shadowbox again, it will recreate that original mask, clear the masks, and the geometry goes away. And let's do another bit of masking here. I'm going to hold down the Control key, access my masking brush, and let's change to drag rectangle. And I'm going to go to my texture menu, and I'm going to import a texture. Let's import this tattoo stencil here. Select that. I'm going to select that texture and click Make Alpha. That turns that into an alpha. Now I'm going to go to the Alpha menu and click Invert, so it's white on black. Press Control. Make sure that we have that alpha selected. I'm going to turn my draw size up and my focal shift all the way down so there's no vignette. Control, click and drag, and that's going to draw that mask onto the surface. Now if we rotate, you see that's the object that we get. Now I'm going to go to the right view, the side view, and I want to limit its thickness. So I'm going to draw a mask marquee right here. I do not want that alpha as part of it, so I'm going to undo that mask, make sure that I turn off the alpha, Control, click and drag to give myself that rectangular masking marquee, and then that limits the thickness of that item. Now I'll exit out of Shadow Box, and here I have a piece of geometry based on that higher resolution shadow box. So I'm going to show you a neat way that you can further add interest and changes to this shape. I'm going to turn on the floor plane. I'm going to make sure that I turn on the Y plane, and I'm going to turn on the X plane. So everything's off but the X plane. Now I'm going to go to Draw. I'm going to make sure that that X plane, I'm going to set that to 0. So this is going to be the mirror axis for this object. So I'm going to take the transpose line, move this over, the transpose gizmo I mean. Now I'm going to go to Geometry, Modify Topology, and I've got Mirrored and Weld across the X-axis. So if I click that, it will mirror that shape across and weld those points together. You can see it's cut a new edge and welded those points. Let's undo that. I could do it across multiple axes. I can do X and Y. If I do that, I get this type of shape. So it's a really nice way to create abstract, interesting, more complex designs. Now Shadowbox allows you to create all sorts of shapes like this. If I go back to the Polystar, go back to Geometry, go to Shadowbox, let's turn our resolution and turn on Shadowbox. It'll automatically generate a mask based on the star. So I clear that. And I'm going to come down here to the Texture menu. Under Texture Map, I can click and select this texture, which is the front, back, side, bottom view. You'll find this texture within the Projects folder in the ZBrush Install folder. Or when you load up that default shadow box, you can just select this texture from here and export it so you have access to it elsewhere. What we can do is we can load this texture up into Photoshop, and we can actually put an image on here and then generate based on that image. So let's take a look at how to do that now. I'm going to open up Photoshop. Now here in Photoshop, I have that template image open. I'm going to create a new layer, layer 1, and I'm just going to fill it with white by pressing Control A and then Alt Delete while white is my active color. Now I'm going to turn off visibility on that white layer. I'll turn it on before I export it. We just want to see the grid while we're actually making our object. So let's open up that stencil again. So let's grab that stencil. Right there. I'm going to select it and copy it. I'm going to paste it into this document and then transform it and scale it down. And we're just going to place it on the view here. Now I'm going to turn the white background back on, and I'm just going to merge these layers together. Now I'm going to save this as template. Now we'll return to ZBrush. I'll go to the Texture Map under the Tool menu, and I'll click Import. From Import, I'm going to go back to my project files here and grab that template image that we just saved out. And you see that loads onto the object with that image of the tattoo pattern on the corresponding image plane for that shadow box. So now we'll go to the masking menu. and we will go to mask by color, mask by intensity, and that's going to mask based on the color intensity. So if I come over here and draw a new mask, we will get geometry based on the image that we created on the template in Photoshop. So let's go ahead and accept that by clicking Shadow Box, and there's our object. So any black and white image that you can load into Photoshop and paste into that guide template, you can use to establish your shapes. So if you have profiles drawn on your item, you can load those up like a front, side, top views. You can load those up and then generate your mesh based on those profile silhouettes just by masking by intensity. So let's take a look at how we can use this shape in an interesting way. So here I've loaded back in the alien with his helmet, and I'm going to append that insignia in as a subtool. We'll select that, take the transpose gizmo, and let's move that out, turn off perspective, and I'm just going to orient it so it's sort of looking straight down at the surface beneath. I'm going to unlock this, and I'm going to set the pivot to the unmasked center and then lock it again. And just make sure that we have it lined up more or less perpendicular to the surface underneath, as close as you can get it. And there we go. Now I'm going to zoom into this, make sure perspective is turned off, and I'm going to go B for brush, M for matchmaker, and select the matchmaker brush. I will click, zoom out a little bit, and then I will click in the center of the current subtool, which is the insignia, and then drag out, letting go on the background. And what that's now done is, as you can see, it's warped the object to the shape underneath it. So let's do that again. Flattening out again. Here you see we've got our insignia, and we've got our helmet right there. Just turn off visibility on all the other objects, so it's just these two items. Click on the insignia, drag, and let go off the model, and it's matching it to the surface underneath. So if I take transpose, I can countersink that, and it should line up right up with that surface, as you can see there. So it's perfect for taking insignia, tracery, all sorts of different sort of decorative motifs, and conforming it to the shape beneath it. Now let's go ahead and change the material on this. Let's give it a shiny material. Go to Material, Color, Fill Object. Now, any object can be match made into the object beneath it. All you do is just place it, orient it so it's looking down the projection angle, and then use your matchmaker brush to click and drag, letting go off the surface. And that should conform that to whatever shape is underneath it. So let's turn on the head and the eyeballs again. And here we've got an interesting insignia on this alien's helmet that was created using Shadowbox. And the helmet was created using mesh extraction. So those are two ways of generating your own objects inside of Zbrush using masking-based geometry production. With mesh extraction, you're simply painting a mask on the mesh and extracting the shape. And with Shadowbox, you're painting a mask onto a shadow box, which then generates geometry based on that mask. So hopefully these have been helpful and you found this video informative. These are very powerful tools, especially when we're creating props and costume elements. I use them very, very often when I am having to add accoutrement, buttons, insignia, different bits and pieces. One more thing I want to mention though before we end, if we go back to our shadow box item, go to geometry, let's create another shadow box, leave it at 512. I just want to show you one thing that I think is quite neat. Let's turn off frame mode and let's change our material back to basic material 2. When I'm painting masks in here, sometimes I'll go to transform and I will turn on symmetry, turn on radial symmetry, and what this does is it gives me a radial symmetry. So I'm painting in a circular pattern. So if I hold down the masking brush, I'll make sure that I'm on the standard, the freehand mask. There we go. Let's fix our mask brush, put that on mask pen. There we go. Mask There we go. If we mask here with radial symmetry turned on, we can create some very interesting spiral type designs. Let's come down here. Let's draw a new mask here. Let's turn on transparency so we can see through it. And then what we might do is just erase out some masking here. Erase out some masking here, and you can create really interesting kind of gears or teeth or throwing star weapons. It's a really nice way to create radially symmetrical spiral compositions, which frankly would be a bit of a pain to model under other circumstances. So let's go ahead and accept that by exiting out of Shadowbox, and that type of shape is very easy to generate just by using radial symmetry. If we go to the clip brush now, go to the clip rectangle, and we can clip this, like this. Oops, I need to do it the other way, do the rectangle down the center. So using clip brush down the center, there we go, and so that will thin that out. There we go. And that could be a bit of jewelry, or like I said, a spoke or a weapon. These types of shapes, when you're using radial symmetry, are a lot of fun to create, and I think this is the easiest way to make something like that. So thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Now let's take a look at the Vector and Text Shape tool that's available under Z Plugin, Text 3D and Vector Shapes. This allows us to create 3D text as well as shapes from vector art that can be turned into 3D objects, which we can then manipulate inside of ZBrush. So to begin, I'm going to tear off the plugin menu, dock it on the side of the screen, and we want to create a nameplate to go on this bust that's ready for 3D printing. What I want to do is I want to place a name right here on the base for this creature. So this is an alien. We're going to name him Alien Kardec. So let's just put his name on here. What I'll do is I'll come over here and I'll type new text and then just type Kardec. Click OK or hit enter, and then that will create text here. So let's F for focus. Here we can see it's actually rotated because our character, as you can see, he's actually rotated incorrectly. So what I'll do is I'm going to fix that just by going to the transpose gizmo and turn on the pizza box stack there, and I'm just going to invert my selection just by Control-Shift clicking on that, so only the bust and the base are now selected, and then I can just easily do a snap rotation around 180 degrees and then bring him here so he's facing the same direction. So we have this text here. I can change my font as long as it's selected. I can adjust it going through all the different font options arrow by arrow, or I can click and select directly like this. So let's see if we can't find a nice bold font. We'll do an Arial. Adobe, ooh, SD Gothic Neo is nice. That's nice and bold. So we'll use this one. It's got a nice kind of modern look to it. Now, by default, it only has a certain set thickness. What we can do is we can come down here, we can adjust our extrusion to make the letters thicker. We can adjust our bevel here and put a bevel on the edges of each one of those letters. We'll turn that down just a little bit. And we can adjust our bevel resolution as well. Now, what I want to do is I want to scale this down. So I'll just go to my gizmo, turn off the pizza boxes so it's just the selected tool. And let's scale this nameplate down. And we want to orient it and place it there in the space that we've created for the nameplate. So I'm just going to scale it down like so. And perfect. Now I can leave it like this if I want it to be embossed, if I just want the letters to be raised. However, what if we'd like these letters to be carved away? In that case, I'm going to select the base and I'm going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this base. Inside the folder, I'm going to place the Kardec text. Select that and set it to subtract. Now, as long as live boolean is turned on, you see that's actually going to subtract that text like so. So we can actually scale this down Z to make it a little bit deeper. Let's do that. Bring it out just a tick. There we go. Now, if I'm happy with that, I will click the gear icon here and I will just click Boolean folder, and that will Boolean that, make a new object for us. It automatically hides that folder and just gives us visibility on this, the UMesh, which actually, if we select this and go into frame mode, we can see that that is actually geometry. That subtract Boolean is baked into that mesh. So this is really, really useful for creating any type of text object. Of course, once it's a polygon object, we can create all sorts of deformations on it. We can curve it, we can warp it, we can do anything that we want with it because it is a polygon object. Now let's take a look at another thing that we can do in this plugin, and that is adjust SVG, that scalable vector graphic format. Those are basically paths. Typically they're created in Adobe Illustrator. It's just vector art. So if I click New SVG, let's go ahead and actually create a new tool here. I'm going to create a sphere. Let's do a polysphere. We'll divide this a few times. And then I'm going to create a new SVG. Here we have a pattern SVG file. I'm just going to open that. And now, if we press F for focus, you can see that that vector graphic, which is just a selection of curves, has been turned into actual geometry. Now, of course, I can adjust my extrusion. If I don't want it to be quite so thick, we can turn that extrusion down. And we can turn our resolution up if we want there to be more resolution to that piece. I think I made that too thin. Let's turn our extrusion up just a little bit more. Oops, not quite that much. And let's turn our bevel down. I don't want a bevel on this. I just want to keep the graphics as they are. So here we have a nice extruded 3D object that we got from that SVG file. Now I want to unify this so it's the same size as that sphere. So I'm going to go to Deformation and I'm going to click Unify. And that'll scale, well, it should scale that down. Let's go to the sphere, Deformation, Unify. There we go. So now the sphere is the same size as that vector graphic, which has been turned into a 3D object. Let's select that 3D SVG. Let's go ahead and scale that down a little bit, and I'll show you a neat thing that we can do. If I go to B for brush, M for matchmaker, and select the matchmaker brush here. Now if I just hold down, click and drag, what that does is it deforms that mesh to match what's underneath it. So if I can take the move brush now and I can countersink that so it lays perfectly against the surface of that sphere. Now that brush is B for brush, M for matchmaker, and it is the matchmaker brush here. So this is really nice if you've got vector art that you want to use to create tracery or details on armor or costume elements. It's very, very easy to take that, turn it into a three-dimensional object, and then matchmake it to an underlying surface so it deforms and lays perfectly against that surface. So that is the 3D text and vector shape menu. Hopefully you found this useful and you can see ways that you can incorporate this into your own workflow. Thanks for watching. In this chapter, we're going to look at Z-spheres. Z-spheres are an older tool within Zbrush. They've been around for many, many years, but they're not really well known. Many people aren't aware that you can use them as a means to generate meshes inside of Zbrush. I consider them kind of an armature where you draw out a chain of spheres and then convert that to a polygon mesh like you see here. I use them all the time when I have to make something that's a non-standard form, maybe a character with wings, or a sea serpent, or a dragon. Something where I won't necessarily have a base model that I can start from. Now there's other methods of doing this. You could start purely with Dynamesh and kit bash something with balls of clay and insert meshes. I think Z-spheres work nicely where you're creating that armature and then generate a mesh from that. So you get a nice gesture and you get a nice quick way of creating a base model by drawing out essentially what is a skeleton. So let's go ahead and get started. So to begin with Z-spheres, go to your tool palette, click on the tool palette icon, and then open Z-sphere. You'll find it under 3D meshes. The Z-sphere looks like a red ball with two different halves. One is slightly darker red than the other. Click and drag to draw it on the canvas, and then go into edit mode. And then I'm just going to snap to a front view and turn on X symmetry so I see 2 green dots. Now, this first Z-sphere is called the root sphere. This is the only sphere that you can't delete. And this is the sphere that will be the parent for all the other spheres we're going to draw in our chain. So to begin, turn your draw size down, all the way down. Now, Z-spheres are one of the few things in ZBrush where I think it's better to use a mouse than a tablet pen. Simply because it's very easy with a tablet pen to tap extra times and create spheres that you don't want to create. So I think it's best, if you can, use a mouse, but you don't have to. Just be very careful that you don't draw extra spheres by accident. So, bring the 2 dots together, and then click and drag to draw a child sphere. Now, if I keep dragging, it'll make it bigger. Drag in the opposite direction, it makes it smaller. I want this child sphere to be the exact same size as the parent, so I'm going to press and hold the Shift key, let go of my cursor, and then let go of Shift. Now you'll see that sphere has a little white dot in it. That just means that sphere is selected. So after I've drawn a sphere, I will double-click off the model, and that just deselects my Z-sphere. And that's just good practice as you're drawing Z-spheres. After each one, double-click off the model to clear your selection. Now we can see you've got your root sphere, and then we have a child sphere coming out from the bottom. Now the root sphere has to have a sphere on either side to be a solid mesh, so let's rotate to the other side and do the same thing here. Bring the 2 greens dot together, click and drag, press and hold the Shift key, let go of the cursor, let go of Shift, and double-click off the model. And that creates something that looks like this. We have the root sphere in the center and a child sphere on either side. Now, this is the bare basics, the most simple 3D mesh that we can create using Z-spheres. Let's see what this will generate. Under the Tool menu, come down here to Adaptive Skin. Under Adaptive Skin, you see there's a button called Preview. If I press the Preview button, it will show me the mesh that will be created. And if I go into Frame Mode with Shift F, I can see the actual polygons themselves. Now, right now, this is set to create a Dynamesh mesh because Dynamesh resolution is turned up. If I turn Dynamesh down to 0 and then press Preview again, that will show me the actual polygon model that will be created. Not a Dynamesh, but just the most low resolution, simple poly mesh with organized edge loops and all quads. My preference is to turn my Dynamesh resolution down and just generate a polygon mesh using Z-spheres because I can always Dynamesh it later. Now the hotkey for preview, as you can see, when we mouse over it, is the letter A. So if I press the A key, it'll bring me back into Z-sphere mode. So I'll press Shift F to turn off frame mode, and I'll press W for move. I'm going to grab the top child sphere and drag it up, grab the bottom child sphere and drag it down. So this is the central torso of our character as it stands so far. I will go to E for scale, click and drag, and I can scale that root Z-sphere up, and then go to W for move, and then we'll just position it so we get a little bit of an S-curve to the body. Go back to Q for draw, double-click off the model, and now we're going to add shoulders and hips. So for shoulders, I'm just going to click and drag on either side of that top Z-sphere, double-click off the model, and I'm going to click and drag at the waist to create hips. Double-click off the model, and then press the A key to preview the mesh that will generate. If I go to Shift F mode, you'll see each new Z-sphere creates a new polygroup. Now, these polygroups are very similar in color, but those shoulders are a separate polygroup from the torso. And here you can see very clearly that the hips are a separate polygroup from the body itself. See, as I Control-Shift-Click on these polygroups, I can isolate them. So press the A key to drop back into Z-sphere mode. Go to Q for draw, and let's draw some arms on here. I'm going to click and drag, press the Shift key, and then double-click off the model. That makes the new child sphere the same size as the parent. Go to W for move, and just drag those arms off, and maybe drag those shoulders out just a tick. I'll go to Q for draw, click and drag, press the Shift key to snap it to the same size. Let's zoom out a bit, W for move, and then drag those legs down. Maybe widen the hips a bit. Go to E for scale, and let's just scale down that torso. Now,
As I'm shifting and moving these things around, you want to be careful that your draw size isn't set higher than 0. If I turn my draw size all the way down to 1, that's perfect. But if it's higher than that, you might accidentally grab multiple Z-spheres while you're trying to move things around. So I'm going to press the A key and just preview the mesh that's being generated. Now, Z-sphere models I consider to be very similar to an armature when you're sculpting. An armature just being kind of a wire base that you put clay on top of when you're sculpting. Z-sphere mesh is very, very similar to me. I treat it as a very simple base mesh that I'm going to quickly start sculpting on and changing the volumes. It gives me just a basic framework to support my sculpting. So let's press the A key again. Always preview as you're drawing. Don't draw a bunch of Z-spheres and then preview. I try and preview after each one just to make sure there's no problems. So I'm going to go to Q for draw. Now, I can actually insert Z-spheres along the chain just by clicking here between the shoulder and wrist. I'm going to click there, and that adds a new Z-sphere. Go to W for move, and I can pull that down just slightly. Pull the wrist out. E for scale, and I'll scale the wrist down. R for rotate. If I click in between these two Z-spheres, I can rotate these spheres. Go to E for scale. Let's scale that elbow down just slightly. And then press the A key to preview our mesh. Go to W for move, and let's just pull that forward. Pull the elbow down. And just get a nice proportion here. And I'll go to W for move and just adjust that torso position and press the A key to preview. Press the A key again to leave preview mode, and we'll do the same thing here for the legs. I'm going to go to Q for draw, and I'm going to insert two spheres for the knees. E for scale, and I'm going to scale the ankles down. I'm going to go to R for rotate, and let's just rotate those legs slightly. W for move, we'll just change the position of the knee and the ankle. R for rotate, and let's just open those legs slightly. Press the A key, and that previews our mesh. And again, don't worry about the fact that you don't have the volume in the hips or the volume in the rib cage yet, because that will come. We're going to dynamesh this later and start sculpting on it, so it doesn't matter if it's not the exact correct volume. You could go in here and keep adding Z-spheres to adjust the volume, but I feel that's a waste of time, because in the time it takes you to add a Z-sphere and change the volume, you could do that faster once you're in sculpting mode and you're actually sculpting on the mesh.
So let's go ahead and add feet. We'll zoom into the ankles, go to Q for draw, start dragging to draw a child sphere and press the shift key to snap it, and then double click off the model. Rotate it around to the back and we'll add the heels the same way, snapping, and then double click off the model, and then use W for move to stretch those out to give the length of the foot. Press the A key to preview the mesh. Again, this is just your mesh preview. We'll press the A key once again to leave that preview. Let's go ahead now and add some hands. Let's zoom into the wrist. I'm going to draw a child sphere, snap it to the same size, and then move to pull it away slightly. E for scale to scale it up. Now that's going to be the body of the hand, the palm. I'm going to do Q for draw, and I'm going to draw a thumb, just a large Z-sphere here, double click. Draw a child Z-sphere, snapping it to the same size, and then go to W for move and pull that sphere out. Press the A key to preview, so that's going to be our thumb. Press the A key again to drop out of preview mode. Zoom into the hand here and go to Q for draw. And we're going to add 4 child spheres here. So let's do 1. Oops, undo that. We added an extra sphere there by accident. So let's just click and drag to draw 1 sphere, double click off the model. Click and drag, double click off the model, click and drag, double click off the model, click and drag, double click off the model. Now, again, I added an extra Z-sphere by accident, so I'll just undo that. Press the A key, and you can see there's the roots of our 4 fingers and our thumb. Now I'm going to draw the fingers themselves, and I will do that by clicking and dragging on the parent sphere and just holding down the shift key, and then double click off the model. And that just snaps that extra sphere to be the same size as the parent. Now I'll go to W for move, and let's pull these finger spheres out.
Now I'm going to go to W for move again, and I'm going to move that pinky finger down just slightly. So the fingers kind of follow a bit of an arc here. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect in its shape. We can fix this in sculpting. I just want to get the most basic kind of volumes in here, so we've got something to start working with once we go into sculpting mode. Let's pull that middle finger out slightly, and then press the A key to preview our hand. Now I want to scale down the thumb. Press the A key to go back into Z-sphere mode, go to E for scale, and I'm going to click in between these two spheres, press the E key, and then hold down Alt and click and drag, and it will scale that thumb down just slightly. W for move to move the thumb tip. Now we're going to add knuckles. Press Q, so we're in draw mode again, and I'm going to add a knuckle in the thumb there, and W for move, so I can add a little bit of curvature to that thumb. R for rotate, let's just rotate that thumb down just a tick. W for move, and I kind of want these fingers to be longer, so I'm going to extend them out. When I'm doing creatures and characters, I always find that, unless you're trying to do something that's highly realistic, if your hands are too small, it always looks like a mistake. But if the hands are cheated a little bit bigger, it always looks like a stylistic decision. So with Q for draw, I'm going to click in between each of these, and I've just added a knuckle there. Now I'll double click off the model, and let's just rotate around the hand here, and let's just pull that knuckle up, and that'll give us a nice little bit of curvature to those fingers. Press A for preview, and here you can see the preview of our hand. R for rotate, let's bring this finger out. W for move, I just want to straighten these out just a bit. There we are. Now, if I press R for rotate, and then click and drag on that wrist sphere, I can rotate the position of the hand, effectively pronating or supinating it. Pronating being when you take your forearm out and then turn your palm to face the ground, and supinating is when you turn your forearm so your palm faces up. I always imagine it's like holding a bowl of soup, so that helps me remember what supinating is. Go to R for rotate. If I click in between the wrist and the hand, I can rotate the hand that way. So I get a nice pose here. Bring those elbows down with move. Go to R for rotate, and I can change the sort of posture of the character here just by adjusting with rotate how the body relates to itself. So let's go ahead and put a head on there. So let's zoom into the torso, Q for draw, and draw a base for the neck. Press the A key, and you can see there's the beginnings of our neck. Double click off the model, and we'll draw a new sphere. Hold down Shift to snap it to the same size. W for move, and we'll extend that neck up. And let's just bring this sphere forward. Always remember that the neck comes out of the torso at an angle from the front. It doesn't do this. A lot of beginners do this. They grow the neck straight up out of the rib cage. That's not accurate. It's very, very important to remember your first rib is at a bit of an angle here, and the neck curves up out of that angle. So press the A key for preview, and here we've got the beginnings of our neck. Now we'll draw the head itself. I'm just going to come up here, draw a new sphere for our head, and now I'm going to press the A key, and you'll notice the head disappears. The reason for that is the head is intersecting with the previous spheres. If I take W for move and then bring it up so I can see the transitional rings here, now we'll actually have the head. Now, I again treat Z-spheres as an armature. So I don't spend a lot of time worrying about the volume of the head or edge looping because I am going to Dynamesh it. However, if you wanted to add more detail here, for example, get some edge looping, I would just draw two spheres for eyes, double click off the model, draw a sphere for the mouth, double click off the model, maybe some spheres for ears, double click off the model, and then press the A key. Now, it might look quite strange to you, but this does give you an extrusion pattern where you've got edge looping that you could then push in for the eyes, pull out for the ears, and push in for the mouth. And this would be useful if you plan to stay in this topology, but again, I don't feel that that's a valid workflow anymore. That used to be how I taught Z-spheres. However, now we're going to Dynamesh. invariably we're going to end up dynameshing. So I think it's best to create the most basic volumes very quickly, dynamesh, and then start sculpting your eye sockets and your mouth and ears. I don't feel that it's really necessary to do this, but I did want to show it's possible in case going forward you find you're in a situation where you need to stay in this low resolution topology and have some kind of edge looping to work with to begin with. But once again, you can always Z-remesh this as well. We have a lot more freedom than we used to when we're working with Z-spheres. Now, Z-spheres, again, they are a very old tool in ZBrush. They date back several years, and a lot of people really aren't aware of them because they're so old, and I think they're a very, very valuable, valid method for creating a mesh directly inside of ZBrush. So let's press the A key, W for move, and I'm just going to stretch, hold down the Alt key, I'm just going to stretch these legs down. I want these to be a little bit longer. There we are. And if we wanted to put toes in there, we would do the exact same thing we did before with the hands. Go to Q for draw, and I'm going to treat the big toe like I treated the thumb. Create a root that comes off the side, then create a child sphere. W for move. And let's pull that child sphere forward, and then add a knuckle in the middle. I'll go to E for scale and just scale up the tip, and then press the A key. That's going to be our big toe. And now we're just going to create 4 spheres for the other toes. Double click off the model and go to Q for draw, and there'll be 1, double click off the model, 2, double click off the model, 3, double click off the model, 4, and double click off the model. Press the A key to preview. Always preview to make sure that your mesh is not turning inside out or you don't have an extra Z sphere that you're not aware of. Now we'll create our child spheres. Remember to press and hold shift to snap them to the same size, and then always double click off the model after each sphere. W for move, we can bring those toes forward, and then preview. Now there's going to be gaps in between the toes just by virtue of the way Z-spheres work. Again, that's not a problem. Once we start sculpting, we can easily come in with the inflate brush and inflate these areas and bring those toes closer together. So that's just down to the sculpting later. The important part is right now to get the volumes. So now we have feet in place. Preview our mesh. Now, let's say that we wanted to do something else here. Perhaps we want to put some horns on the character. Let's come up to the head here. Press the A key. And I'm going to actually delete a sphere here. So if you have a sphere and you want to delete it, press the Alt key and click on the sphere. Oops, let me zoom in so I can get that sphere. Press the Alt key. Oh, that's giving me a problem. Let me scale that up so I can actually get to it. There we go. Press the Alt key. Oop, Q for draw. I was in move mode. Press the Alt key and that will delete the sphere. So make sure you're in move mode. Or excuse me, make sure you're in draw mode. I was in move mode, so if I Alt click on it, it won't do anything. So go to Q for draw, Alt click, and that will delete the sphere. So I'm going to draw those new spheres up here at the top. Q for draw. We'll draw some base spheres here for the horns. Press the A key. That previews that mesh. Press the A key again to exit out of preview mode. And I'm just going to draw a child sphere here. And then go to move and bring that out. I'm going to go to Q for draw and add a couple child spheres along the length of that chain. And that way I can start to adjust the curve of these horns. We can get kind of an interesting effect here. Let's go ahead and draw a child sphere here. For the very, very tip of the horn, let's move that up and forward. Press the A key, and there you can see our preview mesh. I'm going to add one more child in between these last two, just give it a little bit more curvature. And there we go. Now let's say that at this point we decide we need wings on here. So what I'll do is I'll take my shoulders, let's move them forward just a little bit to give ourselves a little bit more room to place wings here. Go to Q for draw. I'm going to draw 2 spheres here at the back. Double click off the model and draw 2 more child spheres and just drag those out and then press the A key to preview. So we're going to treat these like the bones and the wings. I'm going to draw, Q for draw mode. I'm going to insert 3 spheres along here and go to move. And I'm going to just adjust the uppermost border of these wings like this. Q for draw. Press the A key to preview. Press the A key to drop out of preview mode. Now I'm going to zoom in here and I'm going to create some child spheres. So let's create a child sphere here, a child sphere here, and a child sphere here. These are going to be just the bones and the wings. Let's bring these down, bring this down, and bring this down. And then draw child spheres along here, and then just adjust their flow like this. Press the A key to preview, and that's going to be the basic framework of our wings. Now, if I wanted to rotate them back slightly, I could go to R for rotate and click in between the first and second Z-sphere, and I can just rotate those back like that. Press the A key, make sure I'm not in preview mode. Go to W for move. I'm going to add another child sphere here and move that out. Like this. Let's add just a little bit of curvature to the wings, just by grabbing those knuckles in the wing bones and pulling them back. That'll come into play later when we want to create a wing membrane, which is something that we're going to do using Z-spheres, but we're going to use a different method of Z-spheres. We're going to use Z-spheres for retopology, which is another somewhat obscure ZBrush feature, which is actually very, very nice. It's just older, so people generally aren't aware of it. So I'm going to position these, bring these up. And there we go. So now we have our Z-sphere model. I'm going to save my tool, so I'm going to save it as a Z tool. Remember that your Z tool only saves everything that's under the tool menu. It doesn't save everything that's currently active in ZBrush. And if I save this Z-sphere model, I'm going to save it as a Z-sphere mesh. I can always come back to this Z-sphere mesh. I can use it to generate another similar model. I can continue to edit it, or I can use it for rigging and posing. So I'm going to go to my project files here. Let's go ahead and save this. Now this is not a sculptable mesh yet. This is just a Z-sphere model. If I want to make this sculptable, I go to Tool, Adaptive Skin. Now we've been pressing Preview, that's the A hotkey, and you saw that we have a Dynamesh resolution slider here. I want to point out there's also an option for classic skinning. A few versions of ZBrush past, they actually changed the skinning algorithm for Z-spheres. So they left classic skinning in here for legacy. If you have very, very old Z-sphere models, you can still load them up and have them work. I think it's worth mentioning, if you turn on classic skinning, you do get a completely different effect, which is not always desirable. So be aware that that button is there. If you have that turned on, it will not look like the mesh that I've created. So I can adjust my density. My density is simply the number of subdivision levels that will be created when I make my mesh. Again, I turn Dynamesh resolution down to 0 because I'm going to Dynamesh it anyway, and I'd rather just start with my base lowest subdivision levels, continue to sculpt on that, and then choose when to Dynamesh. Now here's the important part, Make Adaptive Skin. If I press Make Adaptive Skin, watch up here in the tool palette, you're going to see a new tool appear. Click Make Adaptive Skin, and now I have Skin Z-Sphere. If I click that, this is an actual polygon model. I can Shift D and step down my 2 subdivision levels and step up. This can be subdivided, sculpted, Dynameshed. This is what we're actually working on. Your Z-sphere model, this is separate from your skin mesh. What I like to do is take my Z-sphere mesh, go to Subtool, and then append that skin into it. So I'm always carrying that Z-sphere mesh around. That Z-sphere chain can be used for rigging, can be used for posing, and it can be utilized once again if I want to make some changes. But you can't change your skin by going back and changing your Z-sphere chain. Once you've created your skin, this is a separate Z tool. So I just appended into the stack here, so I'm always going to have that Z-sphere model available. I'm not going to end up losing it, but the skin is the one that we're actually going to be sculpting on. So let's save our work again.
Now we're ready to start sculpting. We've got 2 subdivision levels because we had that set under adaptive skin. So at this stage we can come in, I might add an extra subdivision level, go to my clay tubes brush, and then turn off the alpha. And then I might start building up volumes. Use the move brush to adjust the volumes and the silhouettes. Again, the whole idea of Z-spheres is just to create the most basic armature upon which I can then sculpt. I'm not concerned about getting everything perfect in the Z-sphere chain. I just want to get a base that I can work from.
There's various ways that you can create meshes in ZBrush now. You can use polygon modeling inside of ZBrush with ZModeler. You can use Dynamesh and insert meshes to build up a character very, very quickly. It's entirely up to you. There's so many different options, but I think it's very important to understand each one. I'm just using the smooth brush to knock back the facets in those horns a little bit, taking the move brush and shifting things around. Now, of course, remember, every single Z-sphere has its own Z-tool, or every single Z-sphere has its own polygroup. So it actually makes it quite easy to organize the mesh. So I might come back here and start isolating just the torso. Again, for polygroups, Control-Shift-Click on a polygroup will show or hide it. So I'm just going to hide the polygroups I want to be working on right now, and then Control-Shift-Click and drag on the background to invert that visibility. Now I'll come back here and start to suggest the scapula and the back, take the move brush, shift that out a little bit, adjust these. And at a certain point, I will be ready to go ahead and Dynamesh. So then I will just do what I normally do and go to Geometry, Dynamesh, and let's set our Dynamesh. Just go ahead and click Dynamesh, and then again, it asks you if you want to freeze the subdivision levels, tell it no. And here we go. Now we have a Dynamesh mesh. I'll turn off frame mode, do a little bit of smoothing to knock away those facets, and we can start sculpting just like we did in our Dynamesh tutorial. It's a very, very cool way of working. Let's turn down our focal shift on that clay tubes brush. We won't do too much sculpting on here, so we want to be focusing on the various tools for Z-spheres. But I do want to show you that it is very, very simple to come in here and just start sculpting on this as a Dynamesh as you would normally. And again, I think this is much faster, just directly sculpting these shapes, than trying to go in and create these volumes and create these shapes directly using the Z-spheres themselves. I think it's just a waste of time. You're using your time most effectively if you treat the Z-spheres, again, like an armature. Take the inflate brush and create the adductors and the thighs there. I can take my damn standard brush and start to sketch in the anatomy of the arm, hitting it with the smooth brush just to knock things back. It's very, very quick and easy. I've started a lot of characters using Z-spheres. A lot of times if I have to do things like dragons or things that are not necessarily bipeds or quadrupeds, things that have an unusual shape, I will start them generally with Dynamesh, start them with Z-spheres to get that base model, and then Dynamesh and start sculpting on top of that. It's just quick and easy, and there's a lot of things that I get called on to make that I just don't have a base model for, especially if it's things like dragons. You know, I should have a base model dragon by now, but every dragon ends up being a little bit different. Or, you know, sea serpents, alien creatures, aquatic aliens, things like that. Things that just, you know, diverge from the standard kind of bipedal or quadrupedal forms. Z-spheres can be a really great way to block that in very, very quickly and efficiently. So again, I don't want to spend too much time sculpting on this during this demo because we've already got sculpting videos that you can watch. I just want to make sure that you see how easy it is once you've Dynameshed it to just go in and start working. So let's take a look now at those wings. I'm going to go ahead and take the smooth brush and I'm going to taper down the tips of those wing bones. I'll do B for brush, P for pinch, select the pinch brush, and I like to just quickly tap the tips of those wing bones just to give it a nice little point. Now, there's no membrane on these wings. I just have the bones. How will we create a wing membrane? we're going to use Z-spheres for that as well. It's a very, very neat thing that you can do. It's Z-spheres for retopology. It's another older tool within Zbrush that's actually been mostly supplanted by the topology brush. However, the topology brush is bad at drawing topology across gaps like this. It excels at drawing topology on top of an existing mesh. If you watch the video on retopology, you'll see that. This fits very nicely in here because it is the Z-spheres video. So we're going to talk about using Z-spheres for topology. So I want to create a wing membrane, which will be a separate Z tool, which I think is a great thing to do while you're doing wing membranes. When I was working on the Kid Who Would Be King, the Morgana wings, I kept the membrane separate on her model for a long time because she was in the design phase and a lot of things were changing. So as I moved the wings around, I could regenerate the wing membrane to match. And then I could easily go in there and divide it up and work on it separately. I almost considered it like a costume element. And then at the very, very end of the process, I would bake the wing membrane into the existing model and then retopologize the whole thing as one piece. So let's look at how to make a wing membrane. So to create a wing membrane, the first thing we want to do is make a proxy mesh that's just the bones of the wing itself. To do that, I'm going to make sure the skin is selected and I'm going to duplicate that subtool. Go into frame mode, and now I'm going to hide each polygroup of the body just by Control-Shift-clicking on it. Remember, any polygroup that you want to hide, if you Control-Shift-click, it will either show or hide that group. Now that I've got the hands and feet isolated, I can go to B for Brush, S for Select Lasso, and then if I Control-Shift-Click and drag, I get this lasso selection. Press the Alt key and it turns red and everything inside of it is hidden. Let's do it again up here. And there we go. So now we have just the wing bones isolated. So I will go to Tool, Geometry, Modify Topology, and I will click the button Delete Hidden. So now I only have the wing bones themselves, and this will be a proxy mesh. We'll delete this mesh later. I just want to use it as a guide to create the wing membrane. With that done, let's go back to the Tool menu, select a Z-sphere again. This is a fresh Z-sphere. Go to Tool, Rigging. Under Rigging, you'll find Select Mesh. If I click that, it opens the tool palette, and I can just select Skin Z-sphere there. That is my wing bone proxy mesh, but you don't see anything because Solo is turned on. Turn off Solo, and there we have our wing bones. Now I want to enable topology, so I click Topology and click Edit Topology. Now the Z-sphere disappears. I'll turn my draw size down, and we're going to be drawing Z-spheres again, but the Z-spheres will look different this time. They're going to create chains. So I'm going to click a point here, a point here, a point here, a point here, and a point here, closing that quad. Double click off the model so nothing is selected, and you can see the outline of the quad is an orange rectangle. Press the A key for preview. We don't have anything just yet, so let's go ahead and draw another triangle here. Double click off the model and press the A key. There we go. Now you see our preview mesh. If I go to frame mode, you'll see the mesh that's going to create in Dynamesh mode. So I'm going to go to adaptive skin and I'm going to turn my Dynamesh resolution down to 0. Preview again, and now we see the actual quads that will be generated. Now if I want to delete any points, I just Alt click on them, and that will delete those points. Those points being tiny little Z-spheres. So let's do this again. We'll draw a quad. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's connect that. There we go. 1, 2, 3. We have a little spare one there. Let's do it again. Oops. Let's connect these 2 points. There we go. 1, 2, 3. Double click, press the A key. There's our preview mesh. So let's carry this on. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4. Double click off the model and press the A key, and you can see this group of polygons starts to grow. Double click off the model, press the A key. Let's carry on another quad, preview, carry on another quad, and preview. Now we're just going to go ahead and connect it to the body, create a triangle there, and create a quad here. And there we go. We have the beginnings of our membrane. There's no thickness to it yet, and right now it's just a preview mesh. We need to actually generate a skin from this. So to do that, I will go to the Adaptive Skin menu, and I will click Make Adaptive Skin. And that creates a skin Z-sphere, Z-tool there, which is just the wing membrane. So if I go back to our original model, we can now delete that proxy mesh subtool, and now we will append in the wing skin in its place. And there we have it. So let's solo this. Now you may notice that there is no thickness to this yet. So what I want to do is I want to go to Tool, Display Properties, turn off double-sided, so now I can see which way the normals are actually facing. So that's very, very important because we're about to add thickness and we don't want to add the thickness inside out. To add thickness, we're going to go to B for Brush, Z for Z Modeler, and select the Z Modeler brush. Click OK. Now, the Z Modeler brush is contextual. I hang a mouse over an edge or a point or a space or a quad and then press the space bar. The menu I get will be specific to whatever polygon element I have selected. If you want to learn more about the Z Modeler brush, be sure to watch the video where we talk specifically about Z Modeler. We're just going to talk about this one function here, Q Mesh. Mouse over a face, press the space bar. Make sure we're set to Q Mesh. As our operation, our target needs to be polygroup all. We're going to extrude all of these polygons. So if I click and drag, it tells me that the mesh is composed of multiple subdivision levels. That's because my skin was generated to have 2 subdivision levels. So I need to go to Geometry and delete lower. Now I will be able to use that operation. So click and drag. You see that it starts to add thickness there. Now, had I done this the opposite direction like this, it would go inside out. So be careful of that. That's why it's very important to turn on your turn off double-sided under Display Properties, so you can actually see what you're getting in terms of the surface normal. So let's add some thickness there. Now I'm going to zoom into the edge, and I want to make sure that we add some sharpness. So I'm going to click and drag on the edge, and that will just insert an edge loop. And I'll just drag them along each side there. Press the A key, or excuse me, press the D key, say yes, and that'll give me a preview of what that smooth mesh is going to look like. Shift D will step out of that preview. If I'm happy with that, let's turn off solo so we can see the wing bones. Now we have our polygon mesh for the wing membrane with thickness. So I'm going to add a couple subdivision levels with Control D. I'm going to take the Move brush. Now if my Move brush doesn't get large enough, double click the dynamic button there that's inside the slider and I can get the Move brush larger. We're just basically going to manually shift these faces so they're sitting inside the wing bones. Again, this can all be merged into a single subtool later. I just want to make sure that the wing membrane is exactly where I want it to be. You'll notice also that my Z-sphere model is visible, so I'll go to my subtool menu and I'll just turn off visibility on that. Step down a couple subdivision levels and let's just add some curvature, some scalloping in between each one of these wing bones. Step up another subdivision level, and we can carry on adding a little bit more scalloping here. Let's turn off frame mode. Shift F turns frame mode off, and we'll add another subdivision level or two and add some smoothing here. Take the Move brush, hold down the Alt key, and you can push in and out with the Move brush, which is really handy for things like this. This technique works really great for costume elements, wing membranes, fish fins. If I go to the Move brush and go to Curve and turn on Accurate Curve mode, my Move brush will give me a nice point as I pull these points down. It makes it nice and sharp. There we go. Now if I Alt-click on the wing bones themselves, I can give them just a little bit of smoothing. If I want to add a little bit of a tapering in between each joint, go to my Move brush and maybe we'll pull some little points off of this, change the curvature of that just a little bit. Turn this down and we'll just pull these down into points. Alt-click on the wing membrane again. We can add some smoothing to this and shift this around again. There we go. Now if I want to sculpt on these wing membranes, which of course I'm going to want to do, what I'll need to do is go in, Let's take our standard brush and let's select alpha 58. Let's say that we want to sculpt some wrinkles on here. So we need to have enough geometry to accept that. So let's divide it up to, let's go to geometry, and let's divide to about 1,000,000 faces. Now if I hold down the Alt key and start creating sort of a wrinkle pattern in these wings, watch what happens. If I roll around to the back side, you might see, depending on how large my brush size is, I might get bleed through. If I do, I need to go to auto masking and make sure that back face masking is turned off. So if we turn off back face masking and repeat those strokes, watch what happens. If I start sculpting wrinkles in these wings, you see it bleeds through to the back side and it's in reverse. It's recessed on the back, but not on the front. So what I want to do here is get my sculpting isolated to just one side of that membrane. So I need to go to Brush, Auto Masking, make sure back face masking is turned on. Now watch what happens. If I sculpt now with back face masking turned on, I can add these wrinkles in this membrane, but it doesn't bleed through to the other side. If I go to the back side, and let's change to a different alpha here so we can see that it definitely doesn't bleed through. We'll go to Spray, and we'll just add this texture to the back. And again, you see that that does not transfer over to the front. That is back face masking under Brush, Auto Masking, Back Face Masking. So that is how we can use Z-spheres as a topology tool to actually generate new topology. You could feasibly use it to retopologize a model, but in that case, I believe that the topology brush is a better solution, as well as Z-remodeler or Z-remesher. At this point, those two newer tools supplant Z-spheres as a retopology tool, but Z-spheres are still very, very powerful as a tool for actually generating new meshes. Now, let's take a look at one more thing we can do with Z-spheres. We can use Z-spheres to rig a character, which is actually quite a cool thing to do if you're more accustomed to rigging and posing in like an FK, IK kind of situation where you've got bones that you're manipulating in Maya or 3D Studio Max. And let's take a look at how we can do that. Now here we have the NICZ default human male mesh that comes preloaded with Zbrush. I'm going to go to my tool menu and select a Z-sphere once again. This time I will go down to my rigging menu, select mesh, and let's select that human mesh. Now I have the Z-sphere selected. I will go to E for scale, and I'm going to scale this down, and this is going to be my root Z-sphere. This will be the center of the rig, of the skeleton. Make sure the X symmetry is turned on so I can move it up and maintain the center line. E for scale, and we'll scale it down. Turn on solo, so I'm just looking at that Z-sphere. And I'm going to go to draw, turn my draw size down, and let's draw a child sphere, holding the shift key to snap it to the same size. Roll around to the bottom and do the same thing on the bottom. Double click off the model, zoom out, and then turn off solo mode. Go to W for move, and let's move this sphere up to the torso and this one down to the hips. Let's go back to draw. Let's draw a child sphere here. For our shoulders. W for move. Let's move these back. Move this back. Let's move that root sphere up a bit. And there we go. Let's draw a child sphere for the arms. Move this one down. Make sure that it's sitting inside the elbow. Draw another sphere for the wrist. Bring that down to the wrist. Now each one of these spheres, when it's rigged, is going to capture the vertices around it. So I could go in here and I could actually rig each individual finger. Or if I want to put just a large Z-sphere here at the hand, this should capture all the vertices of the fingers themselves. Then I find that it's actually easier to pose fingers using transpose, but I don't mind posing the body using a Z-sphere chain like this. Let's add another sphere right here just to catch that thumb. Bring that out. Draw another child sphere here. Bring this down, just rotating around and being very sure that we're placing these spheres inside that mesh. Now I'm going to come back to the torso here. I'm going to draw two child spheres here. Let's move them out and off to the sides. Can be a little tricky to grab them. There we go. And these spheres are just going to serve to capture the rib cage. Let's draw some hip spheres here. Move them into position. Draw two child spheres for the legs. And let's bring these down and place them in the knees. Now for the knees, I like to create two spheres. I'll create another child sphere here. Bring this down so the knee actually has two spheres representing it rather than just one. I find that gives me a slightly better deformation. Let's move this sphere down to the ankle. Press the E key so we can scale it down. And let's add another sphere in there and just move it back ever so slightly to get that curvature of the shin. Draw a child sphere here. Move that forward for the toes. Draw a child sphere here and move that down and back for the heel. There we go. Now, if I press the E key and then just Alt, click and drag between the root Z sphere and any other sphere, I can scale down my skeleton, so it might be a little bit easier to see the model underneath. I'm going to take the move and bring the torso up. I'm going to draw another sphere here for the neck. Place that there. Put a sphere in between and just shift that around so we're getting quite an accurate curvature to the head or to the neck there. Let's turn on solo so we can see this very clearly. I'm going to draw a sphere here for the head. Turn off solo and then just move that up. Remember, we need to see the transitional spheres there for the neck. Great. So now we have our skeleton. I'm going to click Bind Mesh. Now what's happened is that skeleton is bound to the underlying mesh. So if I turn off my X symmetry and go to R for rotate, I can click and drag and I can rotate these Z tools, or these Z spheres, I mean to say. So if I click here, bring this up, rotate this down, I can rotate the forearm. Maybe I want to bend the wrist. I can do that. Let's bend the leg. So I'll click and drag to rotate that. I'll click and drag to rotate that. And you see what I mean about getting a nicer bend there if I've got a couple spheres for the knee. If I click and drag, I can bring the foot down. Let's bring the heel back a little bit. Let's rotate that leg out. You see everywhere that we've got a sphere, it's smart. It's capturing the vertices that are related to that particular sphere. Let's bend that back. We can bring the whole torso forward. Let's bring the neck up, bring the head up. Now here you see that we're not catching enough vertices in the chin, so you probably want to add another sphere to capture those chin vertices. If I click and drag, go to rotate, hold down the Alt key. There we go. Just click and drag. I can turn that head. And then when I'm happy with my pose, let's go ahead and do a little tweak to this foot here. Let's rotate that up. There we go. When I'm happy with that pose, I'll go to Adaptive Skin and click Make Adaptive Skin. And then I've got a skin that represents my posed model. Now, of course, you're never going to get a perfect bind here. You will have to go in with your move brush and sculpt some corrections. But what's important is that you've actually been able to pose that model. If I go back to Adaptive Skin, my pose here, go to Adaptive Skin. If I turn my Dynamesh resolution down and make Adaptive Skin, my new skin, there we go, you see is actually composed of normal polygons with 2 subdivision levels rather than being a Dynamesh mesh as we have here. So Z-spheres are a very, very powerful rigging tool that allow us to go in and have rigging that might be more similar to things that you're familiar with, just taking an armature, taking a skeleton, putting it inside your model, posing it, and then sculpting from there. Now, anytime you start posing a character, your sculpture will become asymmetrical. As the body moves, the pectoralis muscle on this side will be different than that side, so that's perfectly fine. I usually go ahead and pose something relatively early once I've got the basic anatomy blocked in, and then start sculpting asymmetrically from there. Now, there are other methods of symmetry. There is a symmetrical symmetry that you can use under transform. If you turn on activate symmetry, there is posable symmetry. Let's go to our skin here. There we go. Go to transform, activate symmetry. We have opposable symmetry here. And we'll talk more about that in another chapter. But it is possible to sculpt on things like the head that do remain somewhat symmetrical, but the body you really will be sculpting asymmetrically. So that is how we can use Z-spheres as a rigging tool. I think it's very, very powerful to think about Z-spheres as something that you can use in your day-to-day practice. I use it all the time when I have to create a non-standardized mesh, something like a sea serpent or a creature that I don't have a base model for. I use it whenever I need to make certain types of costume elements. I use it for retopology to actually generate new meshes. And there are instances when I have to create a complex pose where I will go ahead and pose with a rig like this, and then utilize that to establish my ZBrush rig and my pose. ZBrush rigs also can be saved. If I save this Z tool, it will save as a rig. And when we get to posing, you will notice that if we go to the Z plugin menu and go to Transpose Master, you can elect to use a Z sphere rig for Transpose Master instead of Transpose. We'll talk about that in more depth in our chapter on Transpose Master. So I recommend that you watch our video on transpose and posing to get a clearer idea of how that works. So that completes this look at Z-spheres. I hope you found this useful and you are able to see ways that you can work this tool into your own workflow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Now let's take a look at ZModeler. ZModeler is a polygon modeling toolset that's available in ZBrush, and we access it by first of all having a default model open. I'm going to open up a polymesh star, draw it on the canvas, and go into edit mode. Now, the best way I find to start a model in ZModeler is to go to the Initialize menu and then create a Q-cube. It's just a quick cube. If we do that and go into frame mode, you'll see what we have is a 4x4 cube with a different polygroup for each side. Now we access ZModeler by going to B for brush, Z for ZModeler, and just selecting the ZModeler brush. So it says that it performs best when dynamic draw size is activated, so just click OK and it'll automatically activate that. Now you'll see that this is contextual. When I mouse over a face, it lights up a face and it says we're going to Q-mesh a poly. If we select an edge, we're on edge functions, and points, we're on point functions. Now this is in the brush menu, but it doesn't really behave like a brush. It's more akin to polymodeling. It's more like extruding and cutting edges, things that you find in other programs. But even that, it's a little bit different. It's a very unique method of working. So it's all contextual. If I mouse over a face, if I press the space bar, it'll open up the ZModeler menu. Now this is set up into a multiple set of windows. The first window will always be your actions. So this is polygon actions, as you can see. If I were on an edge and I press the space bar, this would be edge actions. So this is all contextual. So first we have our polygon actions. So we're going to use Q-mesh. Q-mesh is just sort of like a catch-all extruding and welding tool. It's just really good for quick mesh editing. Next we have the target. Right now it's set to a single poly, so if I click and drag, it's only going to affect a single polygon. However, if I change this to polygroup island, it will find every polygroup that's the same, that's touching this face, and then it will affect that polygroup island. If we do polygroup all, it'll affect everything that is in that particular polygroup. So you see it's affecting the opposite side, which shares that polygroup. And if we do, for example, polyloop, you'll see that there's this orange line there. I can determine the loop of faces I'm going to affect by the direction of that line, click and drag, and then that affects those faces. Now if I go to an edge here, hit the space bar, you see that I can insert an edge loop here. So if I click and drag, I can insert an edge loop. And if I go back here and then change my options, I have the ability to bevel. Now I have targets and modifiers down here. All these menus will have other menus associated with them. For example, Q Mesh, we have alignments, and then we have further modifiers here. If I go to Edge, go to bevel, I can set it to edge loop complete, edge loop partial, poly loop. We're going to do a single row linear edge for edge loop complete, and I will just click and drag, and that bevels that edge. Now if we go to a point and hit spacebar, we can move that point. So if I just click and drag, I'm moving the point. We can, say for example, delete a point, or we can Q-mesh. So here if I grab that point and then drag, you see what we're doing is we're basically splitting it off, and it's welding that point to that edge. So it's a very robust modeling tool set, and it's an unusual workflow. I found when I started using it, I found it a little bit difficult to get accustomed to it. But once I really got the handle of the spacebar and the polygroup selections, polygroup island, for example, is the one I tend to use the most, I found it became quite easy and quick to use this. So let's give it a go. Let's see what we can create here. I'm going to go ahead and select polygroup all for Q-mesh, and let's create a dagger here. I'm going to just go ahead and extrude these out a couple times. We're going to create the handle here. Now, as I'm working, I want to see my mesh smoothed. ZModeler doesn't work on a model that has multiple subdivision levels. So what are we to do? That's why we have, under geometry, dynamic subdivisions. Now the hotkey for dynamic subdivisions is going to be D, as long as you don't have any existing subdivision levels. Now this is important. This is something that catches people out a lot. Do not add subdivision levels once you're in dynamic subdivision level mode, because that will slow down your ZBrush interactivity. My students in my online class, I'm constantly finding that they are accidentally enabling dynamic subdivision levels and then dividing on top of it, and they don't understand why their brushes then become very slow. So be very aware of that. In ZBrush 2019, they added this menu, or this pop-up window, just to warn you that you're entering dynamic subdivision levels. So we're going to say yes, and now you can see we've got a smoothed version of our model, but it's a dynamic subdivision. If I press Shift D, we exit it, and we press D, we enter it again. Now here we've got Q grid. That's quick grid based subdivision. If I turn this up to 2, that's going to change the look of my mesh. We can add bevels, chamfers, and coverage here. You can see the smoothing of that. Now what this is analogous to having a polymesh cube, for example. So we have a polymesh cube here. If we were to divide this, under normal circumstances, we're going to lose the hard edges of that cube. However, if we turn off the smooth modifier, the SMT modifier, add a division, and then turn it back on, and then further divide, it will maintain the volumes of those edges and kind of keep that hard surface quality. So what we're getting here when we change our Q-grid mode to 1, we're getting that same type of effect. It's looking like we have smoothed with the SMT modifier turned off. So it's very, very good for hard surface. We can adjust our flat subdivision levels as well. And you see the different types of volumes that we get with that. It more accurately will represent that cubic form. Now, if I click apply, what this is going to do is so if I'll turn that up to 1, that gives me 2 subdivision levels. And actually, no, that's flat subdivision levels, pardon me. Flat subdivision levels are as if we are dividing with the SMT modifier turned off. Smooth subdivision levels are just like we're adding smooth subdivision levels. If I click apply, it will now apply that, and now I've got a model with 3 subdivision levels that represents that shape that we just saw. So let's go ahead and create, well, let's turn down flat. Let's go ahead and create a dagger here. So now that we've got dynamic subdivision levels turned on, let's go ahead and let's extrude this poly loop. Or actually, let's do this. Let's do a quick polygroup. So I want to extrude this whole section out here. I want to make a pommel. So what I'll do is I'm going to alt-click on these faces. Let's turn on our X symmetry. I'm going to alt-click on these faces, and what this does is it creates a temporary polygroup. So now I have polygrouped all of these, and I'll just do Q-mesh, polygroup island, click and drag, and that's going to give us a nice nice extrusion of just those faces. So let's do that again. I'm going to alt click to make a temporary polygroup for these selections, and then we're just going to Q mesh that again, and we'll do a one for the bottom here and just pull that out. So we're creating a pommel for that handle. So let's grab, let's say, these faces here, and I'll grab these faces here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mouse over a face, press the space bar, and I'm going to click Inset. Now in the options, I want to inset the region rather than each poly. If I do each poly, it does this. If I do the region, it will create a nice extrusion pattern there. And we'll do it again. Oops. Make another polygroup selection here, and then we'll do it again. Okay. Now I'm going to go back to QMesh, polygroup island, and watch this. If I QMesh this out, it extrudes it normally. However, because this polygon topology matches this topology, if I take this and then QMesh extrude it all the way in, as soon as it meets the other edge, it will cut a hole there and then weld those faces. So let's go ahead now and let's make the crossbar. So let's go ahead and alt click these. We'll do QMesh, polygroup island, and let's extrude that up. And then we'll select these and extrude these out. There we go. Now I'm going to make a temporary polygroup selection here, and let's do another inset. Let's go ahead and grab these as well. Let's do an inset, and we will do polygroup island, and let's do inset region, center only. Oops, no, inset region, pardon me, and center and border. There we go. So that's going to give us a nice area to extrude the blade. Now I'm going to set my QMesh to polygroup island, and we're just going to extrude this blade out. Bring that all the way up. You know what I might do is just save myself some trouble, and let's just go ahead and extrude these like this, so we make sure that we have edge loops going along the length of the blade. Now I want to scale, so let's go ahead and select these faces, and we'll do scale, and we'll do polygroup island, and we can set it to mesh center, axis center, or local symmetry. So I believe we want to do local symmetry. So yeah, there we go. We want to scale that down like that using local symmetry. And then we will just do our selection once more. Alt click on those faces, go to QMesh, polygroup island, and then we will extrude that out. Great. Now I'm going to go over here and I'm going to mouse over an edge and just click and drag. Oops. Mouse over an edge. Make sure I'm on insert, and I'm going to click and drag to add an edge loop here that's just going to sharpen that delineation between the blade and the handle. Now, I will find it easier just to go and just leave the ZModeler menu. And what I will do is I am going to isolate just these faces. Let's do Shift D. Let's step out of our ZModeler menu here. I'm going to isolate just these faces, mask that, go to transpose. Let's move our pivot here, and I'm just going to scale the blade down like that. I find it just a bit easier to do it that way. There we go. And I kind of want to get this bit here, so let's go ahead and isolate that. And we're going to hide these faces here. And we're going to hide these faces here. There we go. And hide these faces here. Now we can really get that scaled down. Let's mask these so we're not affecting them, and we'll just move that pivot over here and just scale that down. There we go. Reveal everything again, and there we go. So we ended up with a little happy accident there actually, but I'm going to undo that. I don't quite like what that did. There we go. All right, so I am going to zoom in here, and I'm going to select these. I'm going to go back to ZModeler, B for brush, Z for ZModeler, select ZModeler, and I'm going to select this edge, and I'm going to go to move. And we'll just move this edge. So make sure that we can see what our selection is. All right. There. Let's move that up. Oops. Sometimes it could be a little tricky to grab an edge. There we go. Moving that edge down. We'll grab that point. Make sure that we're on move, and we'll move that point down. Grab this edge. Move this down. Move this up, and then move this point up. Oops. Again, you got to be careful about your selections. There we go. Press the D key. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and do a Q mesh. Actually, I'm going to do a polygroup, polyloop, and I'm going to click here, and that's going to add a polygroup for that polyloop of faces. Now I'm going to go to Q mesh, set it to polyloop, and I'm going to Q mesh extrude that in to give a nice little crossbar there. Now I want to sharpen that delineation along that edge, so let's zoom in. We'll go to our edge and make sure that we are in our insert. Don't confuse it with inset. And let's leave this mode here, and I'm just going to go ahead and place these edges here and then re-enter. There we go. That's more along the lines of what I'm looking for. Now, you can sharpen the edges of things like this by just adding an extra edge loop like you would when you're normally polymodeling. You can also, if you select an edge, you can select crease. You can set crease to edge loop complete, and then if I click that edge loop, it's going to crease. Oops, make sure that we capture there. No, we got to capture the edge. There we go. We can crease that edge, effectively flattening it like so. So if we come over here, we'll do the same thing there, like so. So I'm going to undo those. And I think I might go ahead and crease this edge right there. So that gives us a nice little delineation there. Now I want to take this handle and I want to reduce the handle so it's not quite so thick. So I'm going to do polygroup, set it to polyloop, and we're going to click additive. So let's go ahead and click this, oops. Nope, there we go. I want to actually select this, so we're going to shift click that, click, press shift. I'm trying to select this polygroup here, so polyloop, alt will create a new one, but I'm just going to press shift after I select it, or after I click it, and I'm hoping, there we go, that will pick up that polygroup. Let's go to overwrite, there we go, and that should overwrite that. There we go. So I've now overwritten that polygroup. So the problem was I needed to make sure that I had overwrite turned on because it was just adding polygroups there. So here I've got a polygroup island now for that loop, and it looks like those are actually just slightly a different color. Those weren't quite the right polygroup. All right, so I'm going to do polygroup island, Q mesh, and let's Q mesh this in, making that handle a little bit slimmer. And there we go. All right. Now we want to address the tip of the sword here. I'm going to Shift D to step out of the dynamic subdivision mode, and I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to mouse over this face, and I'm going to set the face action to bridge 2 polys. So I'll select this poly first. You see the tooltip says bridge 2 polys. Click first poly, and then I'll click the second poly here, and that creates a nice little bridge there. And we'll do the same thing here, and this will give us a nice point there. Very cool. And now I'm just going to go ahead and mask that point at the very, very tip of the sword. Go to transpose move. Let's just alt click and drag to bring that gizmo up, and then we're just going to move that point nicely there. Clear the mask, and then we'll enter into our dynamic subdivision levels again, and we've got a nice blade. So there we go. Now ZModeler has all sorts of different capabilities that I encourage you to explore. Beyond just sort of the most commonly used ones that we've just seen, as you dig into the interface more and more, you'll find there's all sorts of stuff that you can actually do. So for example, something we can do here is if we go back to ZModeler, and if we just do a quick selection, or a quick polygroup. So we're going to select these faces. We're actually going to make it 2 faces. And then we're going to zoom in here, and we're going to do a selection of these 2 faces. Now we're going to go to delete, and we will do polygroup all. Click those faces, and then that deletes those 2 temporary polygroups. Now we'll just Shift D to exit out of the smooth view. We mouse over an edge and go to bridge, 2 holes. We can set it to spline, circle, or arcs. We have the option to do interactive curvature or interactive resolution. That allows you to change those as you draw them. Now there's optimal curvature and optimal resolution, which is what we'll just start with. It gives you the best possible curve between those 2 holes when they're bridged. So let's take a look. We're going to go ahead and click the first edge. The first hole, we click an edge, and then we're going to zoom in and we'll click an edge here. Now we need to be careful because it's a very small hole there, so you need to make sure that we actually get the edge on the hole. So let's go ahead and select that. And that's our first hole, and now we'll rotate around, come back down to the larger hole, and then click that edge. That's our second hole, and now it bridges those 2 spaces. And it creates this really nice kind of hand guard. So I can also undo that, and let's say we want to put it in a different place. So we'll undo all the way back to our polygrouping. And let's do it on this side here. I will create a temporary polygroup here and here, and then we'll delete those. Same process, just delete polygroup all. And we'll do it on the other side as well. Grab those 2 faces and those 2 faces, and then delete them. Now we're going to bridge those holes, so I'm going to select the edge, bridge 2 holes. We'll set it to spline this time though, so we'll click the first edge, and then we'll click the second edge. And you see the type of arc that we get from that. So we undo that, and let's make the interactive work. So we'll select interactive curvature, and we'll click the first edge, then the second edge. Oops, got the wrong one. You have to be very careful if you've got 2 edges really close together. Get the first edge. There we go. Now, as I move my cursor, it changes that curvature. So that's the interactive curvature. It can be a little tricky. You have to make sure that you're always clicking on the correct edge. As you saw, if you've got 2 edges close together, it can be easy to get the wrong one, and then it won't actually create the bridge. And you can do interactive curvature and interactive resolution. We can change our polygrouping. We can change to polygroup rows or polygroup flat. So if we undo that and do it again, very carefully get in here and grab that edge, click and drag. You see that gives us a nice unified polygroup just for that new part. So I'm going to go ahead now and do a polygroup. by polyloop. Let's go ahead and get a new polygroup here. I'm going to click that and then hold Shift. There we go, undo that, and grab that polygroup. Oops. Click and Shift. It's a little tricky combination there. There we go. Now I want to click and polygroup these, and I'm using the polyloop option. And I wanted to select a polyloop group that's not touching this particular section that I want to manipulate. So that's why I chose the yellow polygroup, because there's no other yellow polygroup touching it. So we go to QMesh. We'll do polygroup island. If I click and drag, you see that we can start to scale that and adjust it. Now watch what happens as I expand it. It tries to sort of weld to the other vertices as it comes in contact with them down at the lower end. So be aware that that is something that it does try and do. So I'm actually going to limit this polygroup. I'm going to grab this polygroup here, and I'm going to get rid of these bits here. Make sure I'm on polygroup. There we go. And polygroup this. There we go. We'll polygroup that. And now we'll do QMesh on this section here. So we can create a little step in that, just a little bit more detail, a little bit more nuance. Don't overdo it though like that though, and then you're going to end up. There we go. You press the D key and now we can see the impact that that has. Now if I wanted to do something similar to the other side, I can do that just by going back to my edges and make sure that we're on bridge, and we can use polygroup rows this time. And we'll click our first edge. We have to zoom in because there's two edges very close together. So we get our first hole. Now it wants us to click our second hole, so we'll zoom out and very carefully zoom in and get the correct edge, and then click and drag with our interactive curvature. Now this time you see it actually does alternating polygrouping. So I can do my my QMesh for polygroup all, and we click and drag, and it actually extrudes out those alternating polygroups, giving us this interesting pattern, especially once we go into dynamic smooth. So if I actually want to create an object from this, I go to my dynamic subdivisions and click apply, and now I've got an actual object with subdivision levels. So you see that it's got those 3 subdivision levels now applied. So that is ZModeler. Hopefully you found this interesting and helpful, and you see different ways that you can use this in your own workflows. ZModeler is more than just polymodeling inside of Zbrush. I use it often when I have to create props or a bit of costume or kit. I use it more often than I go to Maya in many cases. But it's also useful in other ways. For example, if you use the topology brush, which we talk about in a separate video, if you create a polygon shell, you can then create a thickness to that using QMesh. So it's good for creating costume elements and thickness and from poly shells for armor and shields. So there's more ways that you can use it than just creating a base mesh inside of ZModeler. So hopefully you found this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Let's talk now about Array Mesh. Array Mesh is essentially an instancing tool. It allows you to create copies of a piece of geometry along a path and then duplicate and manipulate those in terms of their rotation, scale, and offset, as well as their pivot. So you find Array Mesh under the Tool menu. If you go to Tool, you see that Array Mesh is located here. We turn on Array Mesh just by turning on the Array Mesh button, and then we can turn on Transpose. Press W to bring up Transpose Move and turn off the gizmo, and now you see we have the transpose line. I'll snap it to the Y-axis, and you see it has stage and repeat. So this is new. This comes through Array Mesh. If I take this transpose line and then just move the object up, you see it creates a copy. Now I can change my repeats by changing the slider here, or I can click and drag here to change my repeats along that path, like so. Now we want this to spiral like a spiral staircase, so we'll come over here to rotate. We'll go to the Y amount and rotate it around 360 degrees. And now you see it's starting to rotate, but it's not rotating around that central pillar. So I'll snap to a top view and we'll change the pivot. So now I can adjust the pivot. If I click and drag, it will snap the pivot to degrees, or to units, I should say. Take my Z direction and let's adjust this pivot. So I just want to snap that pivot around to the center. Let's get that just right. Let's come around here so we can see our central point that we're aiming for. So we're pretty good in X. So we just want to take Z and adjust Z and get it right about there. There we go. So now you see it's rotating around that central pillar. If I increase my repeats, I get more copies. If I reduce them, I get fewer. That is array mesh in its simplest form. It takes an object, instances along a path, and then you can manipulate those instances. So let's take a look now at a different model. Here I have an object that I created using ZModeler. It's just a very simple box model. You see it's got polygrouping. Now what we want to do is we want to make a circle out of this. Now I could go into my Lightbox array presets and actually find a preset for this. And this is a great way to learn array mesh because you can open these up and see how these different pieces have been created. But we're going to do this manually. I am going to turn on array mesh. I'm going to go to rotate. I'm going to rotate it around X 360 degrees. I will turn up my copies, and as I do that, turn up my repeats. You see it increases along the length. Now I will go to pivot, and we want to change the pivot of that rotation around the Y-axis. So we'll make that, let's try 2.01. That's pretty good. Let's go ahead and increase that a bit so we get a larger circle. We can increase our numbers and then increase our circle. Now, here we've got this nice circular form created from this simple object. Now, this is very, very cool. Because I've got polygrouping here, and the polygroups match on each end, if I turn on extrude and then click make mesh, what this will do is it will bake down the array mesh into a model, but it will extrude those faces. But you see, it doesn't complete the chain. So let's undo that, turn on close, and then make mesh. Now that makes an actual closed 3D object. So this is a great way to make cogs or wheels or any type of object that you could imagine. You can merge them together with extrusions, which is extremely handy. So let's take a look now at another thing that we can do with array mesh. I'm going to open up a model that I used in the cover image for this video series, a little section of human spine. So here we have a single vertebrae. I will turn on array mesh and I will turn on transpose. Go to W and remember to turn off the gizmo if you don't see the transpose line. I will increase my distance and then I will turn up my repeats. Now I'll take rotate. Now let's rotate this around. Let's look at our axis here. So let's rotate this around the Z axis. Now let's go ahead and do the X axis. That'll probably be better. There we go. So I can rotate that around the X axis. I can take my pivot. Well, let's go back and let's actually really turn this up. Let's do this to 180 degrees. There we are. Now I'll take my pivot and I will adjust my pivot. So if I take my pivot and I move it in the Y direction, you can see the effect that that has. Move it the opposite way in the Y direction, you can see the effect that that has. Take the Z direction, and we start to get this interesting sort of whipping shape here. So I think this is quite neat. You might recognize the shape that we're creating if you look at the cover image. I made these tentacles out of vertebrae, and this is how those were created. So let's go to scale, and I would like this to scale as we go down the various axes. So we'll take, let's see, let's scale it in X and scale it in Y. Let's do 0.44 and 0.44. And take Z 0.44. There we go. So now that's scaling down quite a bit. Let's go ahead and increase our repeats along that distance. Now let's go to our pivot and let's change that pivot further. Y isn't going to have much of an effect, but we can change it in the Z axis like this. And let's see, let's go ahead and open up our Z profile. Now watch what happens if we change the profile curve. We can change the character of that swoop. So I want that to be more gradual like this. So there you see the effect that that gives us. Let's go to scale and let's adjust the scale profile here. I want it to be quite big and then suddenly get smaller. Now I can copy this curve, and there's a little close button there. If I close that and then open up the next curve, I can paste, close that curve, open up this one, and paste. And then that will take that and place it on that transform on each one of those instances. Let's go back to pivot, take that, and I think I'm going to adjust that again. And I'm going to bring this down a little bit. There we go. Now I want to go to rotation. So we already have a rotation in the X amount. If I were to change the rotation in the Z amount, you can see that we start getting this interesting twisting, like so. And that's quite a nice looking effect there. It gets a very interesting repetition. I can align to path, and if I turn on align to path, it locks those objects to the path. So it starts to take on almost like a centipedal shape. Turn my repeats up, and there we go. So there's no limit to sort of the very interesting and unusual shapes we can create this way. Now I can add another stage to this array. So if I go to stage 2, I want to go over here and I want to click append new, turn on chain, and then that snaps that new instance to the end of the chain. So watch what happens now. If I go to offset, and maybe let's offset this in the Y direction, and let's give it a little bit of offset in X, and let's turn up our repeats. See that that's carrying on from there. I can go to my pivot. Now, if I want, I can actually select the pivot directly and move that pivot over here. Go to rotate, and let's rotate around the Y amount. Oops, that's a bit much. There we go. So now we get this really nice spiral, but it doesn't blend into the original very well. That's why we have the smooth slider. If I turn the smooth slider up, look what that does. It just beautifully transitions into that other shape. And now you see I've got 2 stages here. I can go to stage 1 and it grays out stage 2. Come back down here where I can actually see the stage, go to stage 2, and it will gray out stage 1. I can also select my stages here with the transform stage. Now, let's take a look at how we can use array mesh to create a nanomesh. Now, why would we want to do that? If you haven't watched the nanomesh video yet, nanomesh is a way of taking a mesh and distributing it along faces of a model. Where array mesh is very procedural and parametric, it gives you smooth transitions between shapes. Nanomesh allows you to introduce randomness. So to do this, I'm going to open up a different model. We're going to make another wall of skulls, but this time we're going to create it using array mesh and then manipulate it using nanomesh. So here I have a decimated version of a human skull model. You see it's quite low res. You can decimate your array mesh base models, and depending on how many instances you plan on making, it's probably a good idea. Because if you have a million polygon mesh and then you create instances along a curve of those and turn that into a mesh, you're going to end up with something very, very dense. So we're going to go ahead and take this, and I'll go to Array Mesh, and this time I will use my presets. There's two different brick walls here. There is a brick wall where everything's stacked up evenly, and then a brick wall where everything's offset. So I'll open up the offset wall, and here you see we've got this wall of skulls. This has multiple stages. If I go to stage 3 and then change my repeats, you see I've got a various number of repeats here. If I go to offset, I can change my offset on that. Let's change that down to 3. Go to our second stage and let's go to offset and increase the offset between those. Go to stage 1 and that'll just be the first one, so that's fine. So stage 2 and then stage 3, I want to change my offset to bring this down closer to the other bit of skulls here. And then I'll go to stage 1 again, and I think I'll turn my repeats down so there's not quite so many. So there we go. We have a wall of skulls that are offset, but we have no way to introduce any kind of randomness to it. However, if I click Convert to Nanomesh, what that does is it creates a polygon plane for each one of those skulls and converts that skull into a nanomesh. So now if I go to the Nanomesh menu, and if you haven't watched the video yet on Nanomesh, I encourage you to do that because we go into this in much more depth. Here I can control the parameters of each one of these instances. I can change their global sizing. I can go to the offset and change their Z offset. So maybe I want to sink those skulls into the wall a little bit. And then I will turn the variation slider up. So that makes some skulls sink in deeper and some stick out further. So you're starting to see the value of this. We can create randomness here. Let's go to our rotation. Let's change the Y rotation. And then let's introduce randomness to Y. So now the skulls all rotate in a different direction around Y. We can do the same thing for X. And we can do the same thing for Z. So now you see we've created a whole bunch of randomness in that wall of skulls. Now this is, again, essentially instancing. These are nanomeshes, so it's not as memory intensive as having all of these individual skulls. If I do want to turn this into an actual mesh, I'll go to Inventory and click 1 to Mesh, and that converts all of those into an actual Z tool. So I can Control-Shift-Click on the underlying plane to hide it, and then go to Geometry, Modify Topology, and click Delete Hidden. So now that deletes those helper planes, and we just have the skulls. So that is converting array mesh to a nanomesh. Hopefully you found this tutorial helpful. I think that array mesh is a wonderful tool that does great work for architectural pieces and organics. But before we close, there is one more thing I want to show you. Here is how we can create organics using array mesh. So if we go to this subtool here and open up array mesh, you see I've actually got an array mesh set up here. I just have a single stage with 11 repeats, and I'm rotating it around the y-axis. If we go into frame mode, you can see this is just a very, very simple object that I created using ZModeler. Now, this has polygrouping. Now remember that we can extrude along the polygroup. So watch what happens when I take this simple object, come down here to array mesh, oops, yeah, there we go, come to array mesh, turn on extrude, turn on close, and then make mesh. Now that turns that into a mesh, and because we've got that polygrouping, it's creating negative spaces in there. So watch what happens when I divide this. I end up with this really beautiful organic form. So that's a wonderful type of sort of alien tentacle or whip, just something that you can create that's organic using array mesh. So don't think that it's only for hard surface. We can actually do organics with this as well if you're creative and you think your way around a solution. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and you find array mesh helpful and you can start to incorporate it into your own workflow. And I will see you in the next video. So let's take a look now at Booleans in Zbrush. Booleans are, if you've encountered them in other programs, a method of subtracting or adding or manipulating one shape through the union, subtraction, or addition of another shape. It's basically like subtracting one shape from another. To illustrate this in the most simple terms, we'll go to the Tool subtool, or the Tool menu under Lightbox, and then open up a polysphere. I will take this polysphere and I'll go to Subtool and I will duplicate it. Now I'll take this duplicate and I'll just move it along the x-axis. Now here you see this subtool is set to normal mode. This one is also set to normal mode. However, if I take this and turn on subtract mode, it appears that nothing happens. However, if I turn on live Boolean, you see what that does is it Booleans out that shape. It Boolean subtracts that shape from the other. If I scale this sphere down, it continues to manipulate that shape. If I go into frame mode, you can see it's still there. It's just not visible as anything other than its Boolean component because it's subtracting from that mesh. So let's do this. Let's take this and duplicate it, bring it to the opposite side, and we'll set this to subtract as well. There we go. Now, I'm going to duplicate this again. I will rotate this 90 degrees, and let's place it in the center again, and let's scale it up to about there. Now, instead of subtracting, I'm going to use Boolean union, and look at that. Basically, it slices away everything that's sitting outside of the volume of that stretched sphere. So if I were to scale this in this direction, it would continue to slice. If I scale it in this direction, it would continue to slice. So you can use Booleans to very, very quickly create some really interesting shapes. Now, you'll notice that all of these are stacked up together in the subtool menu. There's a couple ways to bake your Booleans down. If I take the top subtool and click this down arrow, it creates a start group. If I click that start group, you see it's got 4 pieces inside of it. Now, with this start group created, if I go to subtool, Boolean, and click Make Boolean Mesh, it will generate a U-mesh from that. And however many start groups I happen to have, it will generate a subtool for those start groups. So there I've got a piece of geometry that's been generated from that Boolean. This is no longer a Boolean. This is still the Boolean over here. If I turn off live Boolean, I can see all of my pieces. But here, this is an actual piece of geometry. So let's watch this in action. I'm going to go over to my polymesh star, and let's go to the gizmo and turn this into a polysphere. Here we go. And I am going to scale this in the z-axis and scale it in the x-axis. Now I'm going to go to my deformers and I'm going to select taper, and I'm going to taper this down to a point. I'm going to go back to my deformers and I will accept that deformation, and now I'm going to add another one. Let's do deformer. Let's grab these points here. I'm going to Control Shift click and drag these points. Move those. Oops, go back there. I want to make sure I get all of those points and not just that point. So let's Control click on the background, Control click drag. There we go. Let's Control click drag over these points, Control click on the background to invert, and there we go. Now we can bring that point up. I'm creating a knife blade here. So I'm going to Control click and drag around these points. Let's Control click on the background, and that selects them all. Control click and drag deselects them, Control click and drag, and then Control click to invert. So now I've got these, and this is sitting right on top of this gizmo here, so it's actually going to be a little hard to grab. There we go. Let's bring that up. I'm going to go back to my deformers and do taper, and I'm just going to widen the blade along here. And I'm going to go to flatten. And I'm going to flatten the top of the blade like this. There we go. So I'm just trying to create a nice sort of blade for a knife here. So let's turn off frame mode, and I can divide this a couple times just to get a nice soft, or nice smooth looking blade there. Now I want to create the crossbar for the handle. I think the easiest way to do this is just to append another polymesh star. Select that, go to the gizmo and turn this into a polycube, and then just scale it down, and then move that back where that crossbar needs to be, just about there. Let's scale it in the z-axis as well, just like so. Maybe scale that like that. And let's go ahead and go to frame mode. And I'm going to go to B for brush, Z for Z modeler, and select the Z modeler brush. And let's go ahead and grab these faces here. and these faces here. Just alt-clicking on these to select them. Now, if you have not yet seen the Z-Modeler video, I recommend checking it out. It's a very, very useful tool. While we're mousing over this polygon, I'll press the space bar, and I'm going to Q-mesh, polygroup all, and I'm just going to grab these points and just pull them up. And then I'm going to go to Scale, and I'll do polygroup all, and we'll do mesh center. Yeah, that should be, no, yeah, that should be good. Click and drag. Nope, I don't want mesh center. Let's undo that, and let's change that to polygon center. There we go. We can scale those down now. Now if I press Control D, I just get an interesting looking kind of crossbar there. We can subdivide that a couple times. And now I'm ready to create a handle. Actually, I think I might scale this up a little bit more. There we go. Now I will duplicate this subtool. I will go to Geometry and just delete my lower subdivision levels. That way I can turn this into a polygon cylinder, like this. I will click and drag along these axis controls to increase my resolution. And then I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees, bring it out here, and then let's scale it down the z-axis. This is going to be the handle for our knife here. I'm going to alt-click on that crossbar and just widen that a little bit. Go back to our handle, and then we can just scale that down so it's sitting properly inside there. There we go. So we get a nice little stiletto here. Now I'm going to take that handle and squash it a little bit this way. And there we go. Maybe give it a little bit more length. There we are. Now I want to duplicate this subtool. I'm going to go to my gizmo again, and I'm going to turn this into a ring 3D. Now the ring 3D is pretty low resolution, so I'm going to increase my resolutions along each axis to smooth it out a bit. And increase my radius a bit. And then I'm going to scale this down so it's intersecting the handle. I'm going to bring that back to about here. Now, I want to duplicate these rings going all the way down the length of the handle. Now, before I do that, I want to add a material to this. So I'm going to go to my material options here, and I'm going to select, let's say, Matcap Gorilla. And I'm going to turn on the M modifier and go to Color, Fill Object. Now I'll just go back to my basic material 2, and that object now has that material assigned to it. I'll go to W for Move, and I will hold Control, and I will click and drag, and duplicate that, then let go of Control, and I can keep dragging, and it will duplicate the same distance along that drag. Okay? All right, so now, we're not going to use start groups here. We're going to use a more advanced way of organizing our booleans. I'm going to select the handle. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this handle. That puts the handle inside the folder. I'm going to grab these rings, put them inside the folder, and I'm going to name this subtool Rings. Now I'm going to go to the handle itself, and I'm going to fill this with material. Let's fill this with, let's say, green metallic. Go to the material modifier and color fill object. Now we can switch back to our basic material 2, and the handle now has that metallic material. Now the reason I filled these two with materials is because I want to show you something interesting that happens. If I set this to Boolean subtract, the rings subtracting from the handle, watch what happens when I turn on Boolean. Those rings now subtract from the handle, and they also leave the imprint of their material. Now if I go to frame mode, you can see the rings are still there, and they're not quite intersecting the entire handle. So I'm going to scale them in X. Make sure that we clear any masking on there. Control, click, and drag. And there we go. If we just scale them in X, we get this real nice knurled handle there that really feels like a good grip for this blade. So there we go. And it picks up both of those materials. So I will duplicate this subtool. After a point, I find it easier just to duplicate subtools and then turn them into new objects. So I've turned this into, the rings I've now turned into a polysphere, and I'm going to rename this pommel. And this will be the end point of the dagger here. I'm going to go ahead and scale this in X and in Y. And let's duplicate this a couple times. And let's create a new folder for this, call it pommel. Now I'm going to duplicate this object, put it inside that folder, and I am going to rotate it 90 degrees and scale it down, and then create a subtraction object. And this is going to subtract this shape from the pommel. There we go. Now I'd like to put another shape inside of there, so I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this tool. I will use the gizmo to turn this into, let's turn this into a cylinder 3D. And I've got multiple subdivisions on this, so I just need to go to geometry and delete my lower subdivision levels, and then turn this into a cylinder 3D. There we are. Now this has an option here that creates a tube, so I'm going to turn that up to create a tube, increase my resolution in both these axes, and let's rotate this, and let's scale this down, and let's scale it in X. So we get this shape sitting inside of that negative space. Now, if I take this and put it inside this folder, what'll happen is it'll disappear because it's being Boolean subtracted out of that. If I move it down here, it's not being Boolean subtracted because the Boolean's working its way up the list. So I can put it in the pommel folder, but it'll just have to be beneath any subtraction object. So let's do another subtool. I will duplicate this, and let's turn this into a polysphere. And let's turn our resolution on this down and create this little jewel shape here. And we'll scale this down so it's sitting inside of that. Then I'm going to go to my materials, and let's go ahead and put a reflect red on that. So I'll go to material, color, fill object, and then go back to my basic material too. So now I've got a little space in there that has a jewel sitting inside of it. So if I go back to my pommel subtraction object here and go to frame mode, we can see what's happening where we're getting this this subtraction space, or this subtraction object that's creating that negative space. Now perhaps I want to just make the space a little bit more complicated. I will duplicate this object, I will rotate it 90 degrees, let's bring it over here, scale it down, and then let's make that subtraction object again, turn off frame mode, and then I'm going to scale it along the x-axis here. So now we can get this nice sort of scallop shape. So this starts to almost look like an eye. Look at that. So that's much more interesting as a form. Let's go back to our scale and let's scale this like this. There we go. Move that up. Perfect. Now I want to duplicate this across to the other side. So I just go to Z plugin, subtool master, and I'm going to mirror across the x-axis and merge into one subtool. So that mirrors that across to the other axis. And oops, where'd it go? Oh, I got the wrong axis there. That's the problem. So I'm just going to undo that and go back to Z plugin, mirror, and I'm actually going to do the Z axis if I'm not mistaken. There we go. Now I'll turn off frame mode, and that's on both sides as you see here. So I'm going to take that jewel and place that inside the pommel folder and just collapse that folder. And I'll collapse the handle folder. So now we want to return to the blade. So let's come back up to the blade here. And if we want, we could probably go ahead and put that that handle inside of the, or that crossbar inside the handle folder, just by placing it here beneath the rings. And that'll give us a little bit of a some variety there. While we're at it, let's go ahead and grab the handle and add a little bit of interest to this. I'm going to duplicate it, delete my lower subdivision levels, and let's turn this into a polysphere. Bring that up, scale it up, scale it like this, and scale it like this. And then we'll make this a subtraction object. And then we can just add a little bit more interest to this handle, like this. There we go, that's quite nice. I'm going to divide this so the resulting shape is a little bit smoother. And once again, I will go to Z plugin, mirror, and remember that we're going across the Z axis. And there we go. So now we've just made that shape a little bit more interesting. We could do another here. Let's duplicate this subtool, delete lower, and let's change this into a polysphere again. Let's increase our resolution again so it's not quite so jewel-like. There we go. And we'll move this up. Let's move this back towards the crossbar here. Scale it down. I just want to do a little scallop out of this shape here, so I'm going to make that a subtraction object and then just bring this down. Maybe scale it in like this. just so it makes a little bit of an interesting form there. And then I will go to Z plugin, mirror, and this time I will go along the y-axis. There we go. So now let's return to the blade, and I'm going to save my work at this point, just to be prudent. Okay, so with the blade selected, I'm going to duplicate the blade and delete lower subdivision levels so I can use my gizmo to turn this into another polysphere. I am going to scale the polysphere down, and then I'm going to extend it along the x-axis. And I want to create kind of a blood groove in the blade. And that's the sort of groove that you'll find down the length of some blades that I believe it's to allow blood to come out of the stabbed animal. Not a huge knife expert, but I believe that's the case. So let's go ahead and scale this down a little bit and make this subtraction. And then we can scooch this down to here and extend that, maybe bring it up to here, scale it down. Maybe we just want to bring it out so it's not quite so deep. And scale it in. Let's turn on frame mode so we can actually see what we're doing here. Let's squash that, turn off frame mode. Oops. And there we go. And I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to go to Z plugin, mirror across the Z axis and click OK. And that'll place that on both sides now. Now I want to put a little scallop right here, a little notch where the blade attaches into the handle. So I will duplicate this subtool, and let's change this into a polycube. And we'll scale this polycube down, bring it down here, and then just make that a subtraction object. And that's just this little notch that you see often when you're sort of a blade sort of sockets into a handle. We'll do something along those lines there. And I will go ahead and duplicate this again. Move this up here, make this a subtraction object. And I'm just going to scale it all the way along the length of the blade, and then I'm just going to use that to sort of make that flat along the top. I'm going to name this blade top flat. It's always very, very helpful to take the time to name your pieces. I'm going to rename this blade notch and rename this blade groove. There we are. And let's select the top item. Let's create a new folder called blade. And then we will drag these objects inside of that folder. All right, so I would like to, I think, move the handle and the pommel together. So I'm going to close all my folders. I'm going to click on the handle group, and I'm going to say transpose set. And everything that's inside the blade, oops, that was the blade folder. Let's undo that. Let's go to the handle and make it a transpose set. So now everything in the handle is in a transpose set. I can move them all together, but I want the pommel as well. So I click the gear and do transpose add, and that adds that to my transpose set. And I can just scooch that up a little bit, so it's closing the distance there between the blade and the handle. And then I can just Control Shift click and drag on the background, or to invert my selection, or turn off the pizza boxes so I'm no longer selecting multiple objects, the pizza box stack being there. It's the affectionate name Zbrush has for the transpose all selected subtools icon. So we can leave transpose mode now. Let's go to our blade, and let's go ahead and fill this with a material. So I'll go to material, and let's make this matte cap satin. No, let's not do matte cap satin, matte cap shiny. Yeah, that's nice. So we'll do material, color, fill object. So now we've filled that with that material. And let's select another material here. Perhaps green metallic again for our crossbar. So let's go to color, fill object. And then we can switch back to basic material too. And here we go. So now we have created this knife using booleans. If I turn off live boolean, you're going to see all the different objects that we use to create it. Now I recommend, saving your work as a boolean, but when you're ready to collapse it down, you can use start groups like we did before, but because we're using folders, there's a much, much, much better way of doing your booleans. If I click on the gear for the blade, I have the option to Boolean folder. I also have the option to Boolean folder with dynamic subdivision levels. Now, if you're using dynamic subdivision levels, you want to make sure that those are calculated into your Boolean. If you don't know what those are, watch the video on Zmodeler, because we talk about that in Zmodeler. It's a way of smoothing a mesh without having subdivision levels. So that's an interesting and important thing to know. But we're not using them here, so I'm going to click the gear on the blade, and I'm going to click Boolean folder. And this is a fantastic operation. It hides the folder and then creates a new mesh that's Boolean. There's my blade. You can see it's got all the Boolean shapes taken out of it. And I'll just rename this blade. Now I'll click the gear on the handle and I will click Boolean folder. It will hide the folder for the handle and then it will give me a Boolean version of that handle. And we'll rename this handle. And we will do the same for the pommel. Boolean folder. And there's our pommel. Let's actually move these to the bottom of the list. And it automatically turns off visibility on everything else there. So we go to frame mode here and take a look at what we've got. It creates the best possible topology that it can. You will notice that sometimes you do end up losing material assignments. So here it has not picked up the material assignment on the handle quite as well as it could have. However, if I turn these off and stay with my Booleans, those materials pick up just fine. That's partially down to the resolution. If I were to take the handle and delete it, I'm just deleting the Boolean mesh version of the handle. I'm going to go back to my handle here and I'm going to go to the rings. I am going to add subdivision levels to the rings. I'm just adding 3, and I'm going to add 3 subdivision levels to the handle. Now I'm going to Boolean this group again. It'll take a little bit longer because that mesh is more dense, but giving it more geometry to work with can often help that material assignment stick. There we go. And there is our handle. So it's a little bit better, but we're still getting a little bit, go to the handle there. We're still getting a little bit of problem areas there. So let's try one more time. Let's delete this and let's go back to our handle. Let's open that folder and let's go to our rings and let's turn off live Boolean. And I just want to take a look at our rings. I'm going to solo this. Those are fine. Let's go to our handle and let's see if we can just increase our divisions on this. Go to our subtools, turn visibility back on this, and turn off solo. Turn live Boolean back on. And let's try this once again. Let's go ahead and Boolean this folder. And there you go. You see, as we start to increase our subdivision levels, that material assignment is more and more accurate. So if you're running into a problem where your material assignment isn't sticking once it's remeshing, it's just because it's remeshing it to such a low subdivision level. You just need to increase the divisions that you have on your Boolean pieces to make that work. Tell you what, we'll do it one more time. I'm just going to delete that handle again. This is the Boolean version. This is the collapsed version. We'll delete that. And we'll come back up here to the rings, and we have 4 subdivision levels on the rings. The rings are probably fine. I think it's just the handle at this point. We'll add 1 more to the rings, and we'll go to the handle, and we'll add 1 more to the handle. Now let's go back up here, turn visibility back on this folder, close the folder, and I will click the gear and Boolean folder. And this should be the most accurate of them all because we have increased our resolution on those 2 Boolean objects, so the resulting mesh will be a lot more accurate. Also, it takes a little bit longer to generate, as you can probably see. It's just a byproduct of having extra divisions in there for Zbrush to do the math on what resulting mesh it'll get when it subtracts this model from this model. It's just, it has more points to compare. Booleans are extremely powerful. It's my favorite method of creating hard surface props. I find myself using them quite often in my day-to-day work. If I have to do a prop or a costume element or any sort of little hard surface piece, I find Booleans in ZBrush to be really, really fun to do. They're also super accurate. I used to use Booleans in Maya years ago, and the Booleans were never really all that accurate. I'd always get problems in them that were pretty frustrating, so it wasn't something that I really used in my modeling toolkit. These I will use in my modeling toolkit because ZBrush not only does these accurate Booleans, but it also does fabulous remeshing. Remember, if you have not yet watched our Z Remesher video, watch that video and note the changes that have been made in the Z Remesher program. We can turn on detect edges, and Z Remesher is much, much better now at remeshing hard surface objects than it ever has been in the past. So that's something to bear in mind as well, that once you've generated your Boolean, you're still absolutely free to go ahead and Z remesh it. Now here you can see that this is very, very accurate. Go to frame mode, it's a lot more dense. Oops, I'm still on the handle. There we go. It's much, much more accurate, but it's going to be more dense, but that's fine. It's not so dense that we can't actually manipulate it. The whole mesh right now is 2 million. Or is that? No, that mesh is not 2 million. Is it? Yeah, that's just about 2 million, or just about 3. But it's giving us those material assignments. And that's really only necessary if you want those material assignments to stay crisp and accurate. If you're not using materials with your Booleans, you can get away using a lower subdivision level to generate them. So that completes our look at Booleans in ZBrush. I hope you found this helpful and you can see ways that you can utilize this in your own workflow. Remember that there are 2 ways to execute a Boolean. You can use start groups, but start groups really are not used all that much anymore. Nowadays, we just click the gear and Boolean the folder. Now there is something else that I should mention. If I delete these pieces here, I'm just going to delete these Boolean pieces, delete this one, and delete this one. If you want to just automate the entire process without having to click each one of those, if you don't want your Booleans to be within the same subtool stack, you can still come down to the Boolean menu here and click Make Boolean Mesh. And what that will do is it will go through and it will Boolean each one of your groups and make a new model up here. And each subtool is going to have its own, or each Boolean folder will have its own subtool. So I had visibility turned off on the handle, so let's do this again. Let's click Make Boolean Mesh. And what it'll do is it'll create a UMesh as a separate Z tool, and that Z tool will have 3 subtools because we have 3 folders. Whenever you execute Make Boolean Mesh, it will generate a subtool for each folder that you have. So anything inside that folder will be part of that subtool. And there we go. There's our UMesh with our 3 subtools based on each of those folders. So there you have it. That's Booleans in ZBrush. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. So in this video, we're going to talk about polypainting. Polypainting is a method of painting in ZBrush that's completely independent of UV coordinates. It's based on per vertex color. So with a model like this, which has 3 million polygons, if each vertex gets an RGB value, we're able to produce a very high frequency texture map. Now, there's a few things that I want to do to this model before we begin. First off, I want to give the render a certain degree of translucency so we get a clearer picture of what the skin will look like when it's rendered with subsurface. So I'm currently on the startup material, which is essentially the basic material 2. I want to make sure that the head is filled with that material, so I turn on the material channel and go to Color, Fill Object, and that just fills the whole head with the basic material 2. Now I'm going to go to the material settings and I'm going to open up Wax Modifier. I'm going to set that to about 50% and click OK. Now under Render, I need to go to Render Properties and turn on Wax Preview to see that wax shader in action. So that gives us a little bit of translucency to this material. If I turn up the strength, you can see it even more. It just helps the skin feel more like skin. Now the next thing I want to change is the specular highlight. I'll do that by going to Material and opening up Modifiers. Under Modifiers, I have a specular slider and specular curve. I'm going to broaden the specular curve so the specular component is less sharp. It looks less like plastic. And then I'm going to turn the specular shine down, and that's going to give us an effect more like skin. So with that done, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how to access Polypaint. Under the Tool menu, there is a Polypaint menu. And if I turn Colorize on and off, you see that that turns the Polypaint on and off. If I go to my Subtool palette and I press this button here, which is a paintbrush, that turns the Polypaint on and off as well. Now I want to clear the Polypaint out of the RGB channel on this Z tool. So what I'll do is I'm going to select a base color. I'll just go to the palette here, the color picker, and I'm going to select kind of a pasty, pale, unhealthy skin tone. Make sure my RGB is set to 100 and I will go to Color, fill object. And this will, make sure that RGB is turned on. I had material turned on, so RGB needs to be turned on for this to work. Go to color, fill object, and that now fills the object with that base color. And I'm actually going to lighten the value of that a little bit and then fill it again. Color, fill object. There we go. That's more what I want for my base color. Now I want to start painting on the object using poly paint. So I'm going to use the standard brush. I'm going to leave it on the dot stroke, and I'm going to turn off the add. Now you can add color and sculpt at the same time, and sometimes that might be desirable if maybe you're doing a scarification or tattoo, or you just want to paint as well as sculpt. In this case, we're just going to paint, so we're going to turn off the add. Now because we filled the model with a color value, if I change my color now, it won't update on the model, but I can paint this value onto the object. But this paint stroke is very even and very much like a spray can. It's not really what I want. I want something a little bit more broken up. So I'm going to change my stroke to the spray stroke. Don't select color spray, select spray. Spray will break up the brush stroke into a bunch of little dots. Now under the stroke palette here, you've got a color slider. Make sure that this is set to 0. If color is set higher than 0, ZBrush will slightly modulate your color selection, and that's not necessarily what we want. So now you see it's a little bit more broken up, but not quite what we're looking for. So let's further break up this brush by going to the alpha palette and selecting alpha 7. That's a bunch of little dots. Now our stroke looks like this. So the idea here is that I want to create my texture from a bunch of passes of little broken up dots of color. Now this is based on how I learned to paint using an airbrush. My background was makeup effects, so I spent a lot of time painting masks and props and bodies and foam latex skins and silicone skins, and we would always paint using broken up dots of color and squiggly lines, because most things in nature are not painted. Most naturally occurring things are not colored with just a single block of color. It's usually made up of a whole bunch of little speckles of color, and what happens is what's called optical mixing, which we'll talk about a little more in a few moments. So with my brush set up like this, I'm able to use those real world, those tangible physical media techniques here in ZBrush, which is something that I love about ZBrush. It's really an artist tool, and it does let you bring those types of workflows and techniques directly into the program. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this brush with red, and we're just to spray red pretty much over the whole character, but we want to concentrate it into the areas that are going to be the warmest. Now I want to keep my brush size relatively small, and I can keep my RGB intensity pretty high. Now I call this pass the temperature map. What we're doing is we're painting areas of the face that are going to be warmer. That is like the cheeks and the ears. And the lighter the skin tone, the more apparent that is, but there is a degree of warmth that you'll find in all sorts of skin tones going across the cheeks and the nose, just like this. Now we are going to place red pretty much everywhere, but I really want to concentrate it in those areas. I'm going to put it into the eye sockets. I'm going to be a little judicious getting it down here in the lower portion of the face, because this is going to typically be a cooler area, especially for someone that's got hair follicles down there. If someone's got like 5 o'clock shadow, that's going to cool off that area of the face. So typically we want the lower portion of the face to be cooler. So we don't want to put too much red down there. We'll put just a tiny bit through here, but not very much. And then I'll spray it down here in the neck. Now I am painting asymmetrically. I could turn on X symmetry, but this model is actually slightly asymmetrical. So I find it's just beneficial for me to go in here and just paint both sides, especially when we get into the later passes where it'll be very apparent if we're painting symmetrically and once we get to the center line of the head. So there we go. Let's put a little bit more warmth in the earlobes. Bring it up to here and here. Now I'm going to put a little bit more warmth in the nose area. And I'm going to switch color now. I'm going to click on this swatch and drag over here to somewhere where there is no red, and that's going to select the base color again. So if I switch, this is my active color. If I hold down the Alt key, it'll spray back in the base tone. So if I kind of overdo it in any particular area, I can press Alt and then spray out that red. And that should be good. So that's our first pass on the temperature map. That's the warm pass. Now I'm going to switch to blue. So I'll just come down here and select the color blue. And I'm going to spray blue into the areas of the face that are going to be cooler. Like I said, down here in the beard line, the lower portion of the face, I want this to be a little bit more blue. And again, I've got my RGB intensity set at 100. It's very important when you're doing this pass to make it overstated. I don't believe it's possible to overdo this temperature pass, but it is possible to not do it strong enough, because this is an underpainting. This is going to be peeking through several layers of color by the end of our paint job, so it needs to be strong enough that we can still see it once we paint on top of it. I'm going to take blue and I'm going to paint it into the eye sockets, and watch what happens here when the blue interacts with the red. We start to get a violet. Things start to take on a purple cast. And that's our optical mixing. Optical mixing is when you place two dots of, say, two primary colors next to each other and you perceive the secondary color. So if we take red and blue and put those dots together, we see purple. We take yellow and blue, then we're going to see green. And you're going to see that happen in just a moment. I'm painting blue into the recesses here, the little hollows of the neck and in the hollows of the ear. And that's because in color theory, we know that cool colors tend to look like they're receding from us, whereas warm colors tend to look like they're advancing. So by painting a cooler hue into the recesses, we can accentuate the shadow in that depth. Because we never want to paint shadows into our texture map. We want the render to take care of that, but we can cool off areas and make them feel a little bit deeper. I'm going to place blue down here in the mouth. So that starts to take on a purple cast. Now I want to adjust my lighting so I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. I'm going to go to the light menu and I'm going to take the key light and place it at about, let's say 11 o'clock, and I'm going to set its intensity to 1. Then I'm going to turn on this secondary light and place it at about 3 o'clock, and let's set that intensity to 1. Maybe dial it back a little bit from that. So that's going to give us more clear lighting so we can see a bit better what we're doing here. Now I'm going to select yellow, and I want to grab kind of a desaturated yellow. And I'm going to paint this in the areas, well, I'm going to paint it pretty much all over, but I'm going to cluster it in the areas where the bone is closest to the skin. I'm going to bring it through the bridge of the nose and the cheeks here. Bring it into the ears. Now watch what happens once we get down towards the blue. Once we start painting yellow into the blue area, the skin starts to take on a greenish cast. I'm going to go to my material settings, wax modifiers, and I'm going to turn my wax modifier down a little bit. I just had a bit too much translucency going. Down here in the neck, I'm going to start spraying yellow into the neck, just like so. Now I'm going to switch back to my red. And I'm just going to warm up some of these areas again, make sure that we've definitely got a clear sense of what areas are warm and what areas are cool. When we're doing this, you want to make sure that you don't make your dots too big. Make sure you keep your draw size relatively small, and that's going to help you get a better effect. There we go. And let's switch back to our yellow. Put a little bit of that in the eye socket. And there we go. So now we put down red, yellow, and blue. So we put down our 3 primary colors. The next step that we're going to do is what's called a mottling pass. That's M-O-T-T-L-I-N-G. Sometimes people call it a squiggle pass or figure 8 pass. Basically, we're going to take the same standard brush, change to the drag rectangle stroke, and then we're going to change our alpha to alpha 22, this squiggly alpha here. And we're going to change our color to white. And now we're going to dial back our RGB intensity a bit, and we're going to start drawing all these little squiggly lines all over the character. And I definitely don't want to do this with symmetry turned on, because once you get towards the center line of the head, it's going to be very apparent that it's symmetrical. It'll create little patterns that look like maybe a Rorschach ink blot test. Now what we're doing here is we're just breaking up this whole underpainting with a middle painting. This is going to be between the underpainting, that temperature pass, and the subsequent layers of paint. And the reason we're doing squiggles of white is because white tends to neutralize and cool off the color that it's mixed with or it's near. So everything that's underneath this semi-transparent white squiggle is going to be neutralized and it's going to be less saturated. And then everything in between the squiggles is going to maintain its intensity. Now what that means, it's going to create kind of an interference pattern. It's going to make the skin feel more translucent because we're going to have all these little fibrous squiggles in it that are going to break up the perception of the color. And we don't just use white for squiggling. I do it for the first pass, but we may go in with purple, we may go in with reds. As you keep painting, you'll find that this mottling technique is extremely useful to break up the skin texture and make things feel more realistic. So we're just going to go through here and paint on the lips. Let's break up the lip patterning. Break up the cheeks. Now, the big mistake people tend to make with the mottling pass is they either make it too bright or they make the squiggles too big. Keep them pretty tight and concentrated around the center of the face, the center of interest. And we're going to paint over this, so we don't want it to be too bright, but we don't want it to be so faint that we don't get the effect of the squiggles. So try and get it about like what you're seeing me doing on screen here. The beautiful thing about poly paint is that we can paint directly on the model like this. It's not like Mari or any other like 3D paint application where you paint into a paint buffer and then you have to drop that paint buffer and bake it into the UV space and then rotate. Because we're painting directly onto the vertices, we can just keep painting and moving around. There's no delay. It's exactly like holding an object in your hand and applying color to it as you move it around. Being completely independent of UVs, this means that I can paint my skin long before I lay out any sort of UV coordinates, and then bake out the texture later. And those UV coordinates can, of course, change, and then I can bake out the texture again. If you want to know more about UVs, I've got an entire video where we talk about UVs in Zbrush that I recommend that you take a look at. So I just want to break this up with more of these squiggles. They can get a little bit bigger as you get further from the center of interest of the face. But don't make them too big. If they're too big, they'll really draw attention to themselves. Let's get the cheeks here. Down here, I've turned on X symmetry, so I'm doing both sides of the cheeks at the same time. And I'm going to turn it off once I get close to the center line, because we never want that to be symmetrical at the center, because it'll be painfully obvious that it's symmetrical if you paint these squiggles at the center line that way. And just making sure that these crisscross in slight variations of size and angle. Anytime we're painting a creature, I always strive to paint with broken up dots of color and various passes of mottling and squiggling. And these layers will build up together and create a very, very interesting, very realistic skin texture. It's much more desirable than just going in and selecting a color and painting it down solid. We always kind of want to add these as broken up passes of color. So there we go. There's our mottling pass. Make sure we get a little bit more in the nose area here. And into that eye socket. There we go. Now I'm going to select my base color again. I can just click here on the swatch and then drag over to the back of the head and grab the base color. I'll switch back to my spray stroke and dots alpha 7. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the base color back onto the model. Now don't turn up your RGB intensity and obliterate your underpainting. We want to rely on doing multiple passes of this base color and just gently push the underpainting down into the skin. So as I start spraying these dots on here, you'll see all that color start to appear like it's sinking down into the skin and becoming more subtle. And again, it's going to become a little chalky, but we don't want to completely obliterate what we've done before. So even though it becomes a little chalky, we're still going to go in and accentuate by bringing back the primary and secondary colors with more passes of dots, but we're going to do it a little bit more subtly now that we're getting towards the end of the painting. So let's push these hues back here. Spray this down into the neck. And if you watch the neck now, the areas where I painted blue down in the hollows, they're starting to really feel like that's arterial blood in there. That's just that sort of bruised differentiation in the skin texture down in the recesses. It starts to really feel like it's living under the skin rather than a color painted on it. So I go to my lighting here, go to my secondary light, turn that off. I go to my primary key light, bring that up here. Go back to my secondary light, turn it on. I'm just going to move that up here. Just want to adjust the lighting so I can see the forms of the face a little bit better. And there we go. Maybe push some of this back into the face a little bit more. Anywhere where the squiggles are super apparent, I might push them in a little bit more, but there's going to be more layers that go on top of this. So if you can still see the squiggles, that's not a problem. Don't get rid of them completely. but I do want to get all those first layers of paint to feel like they're sitting a little bit deeper inside the skin. There we go. So our next stage is to go back to our primary colors. I'm going to go back to red, and I'm going to leave my RGB intensity turned down now, and I'm going to reestablish some of the warm areas. Now we're going to be far more subtle this time. We're not going to go in at the full opacity like we did in the temperature pass. This time I'm just trying to gently warm up these areas. Trying to get rid of some of that chalkiness that spraying of the base tone back on did. Bring this up into the ears. Bring this back into the mouth. Whenever I'm painting a monster, I like to make the eyes and the mouth look real irritated or kind of bruised. I just think it's a nice, unsettling effect. We'll go back to blue now. And I'm going to paint blue into the mouth area. Bring a little bit of blue back down here. I'm going to turn off perspective. Now I'm going to go to a brown. I'm going to go over here to red, and I'm going to pull the cursor down here and make what's called a raw umber. That's a cool brown. And I'm going to change my alpha to alpha 40. It's a very, very small alpha. And now we're going to start putting sort of age spots, freckling in the skin texture. And this is one of my favorite parts. This is where it really starts to come together for me, is when we start putting these little dots of pigmentation in the skin. So let's go ahead and get these freckles in there. And I'm just doing a full pass over the whole character. In traditional media, this would typically be done with a hard bristle brush dipped in pigment, and you would just flick it at your sculpture, and it would spit out these little dots of color. And the effect this has, it just really brings the skin together for me. It starts to feel like sort of aged or weathered skin once you've got these little bits of pigmentation, these freckling or whatever you want to call it, going through the entirety of the character. I'm going to go to my lighting, and I'm going to turn off the secondary light now. I want to see a little bit more dramatic lighting. Now, if I want to see exactly what I'm painting, I can change my material to the flat color material. And because I filled it with basic material too, I need to go to the material swatch here and go to color, fill object, and that fills it with the flat material, and I can see exactly what's going down on the surface now. I might switch color here and select the base tone, go back to my spray stroke, and I want to spray that base color into the lower portion of the face a little bit more. So I'm going to go through here and do a little bit more spraying the base color through here. Now, nothing's happening because I need to turn on RGB. Remember, if you have material on, you need to switch back to RGB to get that base color back. So I just want to bring some of that base tone back up through here. And then we'll switch back to our basic material too. And there we go, that's feeling a bit better now. I'm going to go to my material modifiers, and if I want to see a bit brighter color, I can bring diffuse up, and that will make it a bit easier to see the texture. Let's switch to red again. Turn down our RGB intensity. I just want to gently bring some of that red back in here. So we're basically playing a game going back and forth, tweaking the warmth and the coolness of the head as we paint. Now I'm going to start selecting some secondary and tertiary colors. I'm going to grab a real deep purple here, and I'm going to speckle that into the eye sockets here because I really want to accentuate the sort of bruised quality around the eyes. Come over here on this side and do it again. And do it into the mouth area here. Now I'm going to select a burgundy, like a real deep red. I'm going to do the same thing down here under the nostrils and in the mouth. Speckling out of the corners of the mouth here. Oops, I accidentally turned off quick edit mode. There we go. I'm going to change to my drag rectangle stroke, and we're going to do another mottling pass in selected areas. I'm going to mottle out, squiggle out some of these dark burgundy colors coming out of the mouth. So we get this spidering of veins coming out through the face here. We do the same thing in the eye area. Let's turn up our RGB intensity just slightly so we get a little bit sharper veins there. And I want to put these broken capillaries around the nostrils here, so I'm going to break up the color around the nose, letting these sort of spider veins cluster around the edges of the nostrils. That was a bit too intense. Let's dial back our RGB intensity on those. There we go. I'm going to go back to the spray stroke and go back to a smaller alpha, let's say alpha 47, and I'm going to select white. Now I'm going to speckle some white through here, just all through the head, very, very subtly. And this will have a similar effect to the mottling pass that we did in white earlier. Just gently going over various areas, adding a little bit of speckling. Going back to my red, bringing a little bit more red into the chest here, maybe up the sternomastoid muscles. Just bringing a little bit more flush into that area. And I'll go back to my raw umber, and I'll go to alpha 47, the slightly larger dot. I'm just going to put a few bigger age spots through the nose and the cheeks here. I'm going to go to draw, change my perspective distortion a little bit. There we go. Let's change to our flat color material, and you can see what our texture map looks like in flat shade. Go back to our basic material 2, and there we see it with translucency. So that is how you use polypaint to paint a creature skin from the ground up, with no projections, just painting raw color and mixing color on your object. Now, we also have a video on Spotlight, which is projecting photo reference onto a model for texturing. I think it's very important to understand the idea behind speckling and mottling because, for example, if I'm painting an actor at work, you're never going to have perfect reference to the ear because the ear will always have shadows in the photography. So I'll typically have to paint ears and the back of necks and under chins. There's areas of the face I'll always have to hand paint. So by combining this type of technique with projection techniques, you're able to really get in there and hand paint where necessary and project where possible. And whenever I'm painting a creature, I'm pretty much always trying to paint by hand. And it's quite a bit of fun. And it's a pretty simple process, as you can see. It just takes a bit of practice to get the hang of it. And I think you'll really enjoy it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. There's a couple things that I want to point out before we move on. Under the Polypaint menu, there's a new tool in ZBrush 2020 called Adjust Colors. Now, I have an entire video in this series just dedicated to this tool. What it does is it allows you to make changes to your Polypaint using these sliders down here. So, for example, I can shift my HSV, and we can mask out specific colors using these swatches and make changes right here globally to our Polypaint. Now, I encourage you to watch that video because there's quite a bit of great information about that tool. Also, there is another video on ZAppLink, which is found under the document menu. ZAppLink allows us to texture using all the tools inside of Photoshop and the tools in ZBrush. So it's a really powerful way of leveraging the strengths of both applications. So I recommend that you go check out that video as well, because there's so much you can do with Polypaint. But the purpose of this lecture was to give you the basic understanding of how to set up your brushes and how to go about polypainting. So I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.